The straw man fallacy occurs when someone distorts or oversimplifies another person's argument in order to make it easier to attack or refute. Instead of engaging with the actual argument, the person sets up a weaker version of it, a straw man, and knocks that down instead. This tactic misrepresents the original point, often by exaggerating or misinterpreting its components. It can happen in discussions, debates, or even in everyday conversations. To understand the mechanics of a straw man, imagine a debate on climate change. One person argues that there should be more government investment in renewable energy sources to combat global warming. Instead of addressing this point directly, the opposing side might say something like, "My opponent thinks that we should just throw money at every green energy idea without thinking about the consequences." This is a classic example of a straw man. The original argument focused on investing in renewable energy, not throwing money recklessly at any idea. By twisting the argument, the person attacking it makes it easier to argue against the exaggerated version instead of the actual point being made. This tactic is effective in debates because it shifts the conversation away from the original issue. When people don't realize a straw man is being used, they might think the opposing argument has been disproven. The problem, however, is that the attack was never aimed at the real argument. It's like punching a punching bag instead of the actual opponent. For instance, during political debates, a candidate might argue for better healthcare access, emphasizing how it could improve the health outcomes for the poor. A rival might respond, "My opponent wants to give free healthcare to everyone, even to people who don't need it, which would be an enormous waste of resources." This misrepresents the original argument, as the focus was on improving access, not providing free healthcare to everyone. This misrepresentation is particularly harmful because it undermines honest discussion. By distorting someone's position, the person committing the straw man can avoid addressing valid concerns or counterarguments. Instead of engaging with the core of the issue, they create an easier, more exaggerated version to defeat. This tactic can shift the conversation in their favor, but it doesn't solve the real problem or move the discussion forward. One reason the straw man fallacy is effective is that it plays on emotions. When people hear a distorted, exaggerated argument, they might feel outraged or frustrated. This emotional response can cloud their judgment, making them less likely to recognize the fallacy. For example, in the debate about renewable energy, if someone hears that their opponent is throwing money at every green energy idea, they might feel that the approach is irresponsible. This distracts from the real conversation about how to invest in sustainable energy solutions. The straw man fallacy is not limited to political debates or complex arguments. It can be found in everyday conversations as well. If someone says they enjoy reading books, and another person responds, "So you think books are better than movies?" That's a ridiculous stance to take. They are misrepresenting the argument. The original statement was simply about enjoying books, not about claiming that books are inherently superior to other forms of entertainment. The response attacks a position that was never actually stated. Recognizing when a straw man is being used is crucial in maintaining productive conversations. If you are in a discussion and notice that the other person is misrepresenting your argument, it's important to point it out. Clarify what your actual position is and steer the conversation back to the real issue. If you are the one using the straw man, it's helpful to acknowledge that you've misunderstood the other person's point and try to engage with the actual argument. Sometimes, people use straw man tactics not out of malice but out of a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding. In these cases, it's beneficial to take the time to explain your position more clearly, without attacking the other person. By doing so, you ensure that both sides of the argument are being fairly represented, which leads to a more productive conversation. At the heart of the straw man fallacy is the avoidance of real discussion. Instead of addressing the complexities of an argument, it's easier to tear down a distorted version of it. This approach can make someone feel like they've won a debate, but it only serves to obscure the truth. Engaging with the actual arguments, no matter how difficult they may seem, is essential for meaningful dialogue. In academic, legal, and public discussions, the straw man fallacy can be particularly harmful. It often leads to misunderstandings and prevents real progress on important issues. In these contexts, It's essential to hold people accountable for the arguments they are actually making and not the ones that are being misrepresented. This requires careful listening, critical thinking, and the willingness to engage with complex ideas. By avoiding the temptation to use a straw man, we can contribute to a more honest and respectful discourse. The ad hominem fallacy occurs when someone attacks the person making an argument rather than addressing the argument itself. The term ad hominem is Latin for to the person, and in logic, it refers to arguments that focus on the individual instead of their ideas. This tactic aims to discredit the person, often by pointing out flaws or personal traits, to distract from the actual discussion. Instead of engaging with the merits of the argument, the attacker focuses on personal attacks, which can mislead people into thinking they've disproven the argument. In a typical ad hominem attack, the focus shifts from what is being said to who is saying it. For example, during a debate on climate change, one person might present scientific data supporting global warming. Instead of engaging with the data or discussing the science, the opponent might say, "Why should we listen to you? You're just a politician with no scientific background." This response doesn't address the facts of the argument at all. Instead, it attacks the person making the argument, suggesting that their lack of expertise discredits their position. This approach is a way of sidestepping the argument. It creates a false impression that, by discrediting the speaker, the argument itself becomes invalid. However, the truth of an argument depends on the evidence and reasoning behind it, not the character or qualifications of the person presenting it. By attacking the person, the ad hominem fallacy avoids dealing with the substance of the argument and leads to a breakdown in meaningful discussion. One of the most common places where ad hominem attacks occur is in political discourse. Politicians often face personal attacks from opponents rather than having their policies or proposals debated. For instance, during an election, a candidate may propose healthcare reform. Instead of addressing the merits of the plan, the opponent might say, "This candidate is just trying to gain votes by pretending to care about the poor." Here, the argument about healthcare reform is completely ignored, and the focus is shifted to the candidate's motives. In personal relationships, ad hominem attacks can also crop up during disagreements. Imagine two people arguing over a family matter and one person says, "You always make everything worse. You can't be trusted with anything." This statement doesn't address the issue at hand. It attacks the person's character, suggesting that their past actions mean their opinion is worthless, but it doesn't offer any reason why their current argument is flawed. This tactic can be tempting because it feels easier to attack the person than to engage with a complex or challenging argument. It shifts the discussion from ideas to emotions, often making the attacker feel momentarily victorious. For example, if someone is winning a debate and then is attacked personally, they may feel defensive, which could disrupt their ability to continue presenting their argument clearly. It also distracts the audience from the real issues at hand. In some cases, an ad hominem attack can be an attempt to appeal to people's emotions, which are easier to manipulate than reason. By casting doubt on the credibility or motives of the person making the argument, the attacker tries to get the audience to feel that the argument is unworthy of consideration. The attacker may say something like, "Of course you're against gun control. You're just a billionaire trying to protect your wealth." This type of attack is effective at evoking strong emotions, such as resentment or anger, but it still does not address the substance of the debate, which is whether or not gun control laws would be effective. It's important to recognize ad hominem attacks because they are distractions. They don't address the actual issue. They focus on the individual. This often leads to a breakdown in the discussion, where emotions take over and rational debate is stifled. In many debates, especially in public settings or politics, ad hominem attacks are used strategically to avoid engaging with difficult or uncomfortable arguments. However, recognizing an ad hominem attack in a conversation is not always straightforward. People may disguise their attacks as legitimate criticisms. For instance, an ad hominem can take the form of questioning someone's motivations, as in the statement, "You only care about this issue because it benefits you personally." While the person may indeed have personal interests in the outcome, the attack still avoids addressing the argument itself. It's not a response to the reasoning behind the argument, but a strategy to undermine the person. Sometimes, People may believe that criticizing someone's character or actions is a valid response to an argument. But a person's character or personal history does not inherently invalidate their argument. For example, a convicted criminal might offer valuable insights on criminal justice reform. Attacking their criminal history instead of evaluating the merit of their ideas is a classic ad hominem fallacy. The difficulty with ad hominem attacks lies in their effectiveness at undermining honest discourse. When someone uses personal attacks to avoid addressing an argument, it can cause confusion. It can make it harder to discern whether the person is avoiding the issue because they can't address it, or whether they are genuinely interested in the topic. If you find yourself facing an ad hominem attack, it's helpful to recognize it for what it is. Don't let the conversation devolve into a personal battle. Instead, try to steer the focus back to the argument itself. For example, if someone attacks your character in the midst of a discussion, calmly ask them to address the specific points you've made, rather than focusing on your personal traits. By doing so, you help keep the conversation grounded in reason, which is more likely to lead to productive discussion and, ultimately, understanding. Likewise, if you realize that you have used an ad hominem in your own arguments, it's important to correct yourself. Acknowledge that you've shifted focus from the issue at hand to the person making the argument. Refocus the conversation on the ideas or points that need attention. This helps maintain a respectful and thoughtful dialogue. In conclusion, ad hominem attacks are a way of avoiding the real issue. They aim to discredit the person instead of engaging with the argument. Recognizing and addressing these attacks can lead to more constructive conversations, where ideas and reasoning are the main focus, not personal insults or distractions. Whether in politics, personal conversations, or public discourse, focusing on the argument rather than the person is crucial for healthy, rational debates. The appeal to authority fallacy occurs when someone argues that a claim is true simply because an authority figure or expert says it is, even if that authority isn't an expert in the relevant field. This tactic relies on the perceived credibility of the person making the statement rather than the strength of the argument itself. While it's natural to trust experts or well-known figures, this fallacy shows why it's important to evaluate the evidence and reasoning behind a claim, not just the status or credentials of the person presenting it. Imagine someone arguing that a certain health supplement is effective because a famous celebrity endorses it. The person might say, well, if it's good enough for celebrity name, it must be good. The argument here doesn't rely on the actual benefits or scientific evidence behind the supplement. Instead, it assumes that the celebrity's endorsement is enough to prove its effectiveness. The celebrity may be influential, but they may not be a medical expert, and their endorsement doesn't make the supplement effective. This is an appeal to authority, an argument that depends more on the person's fame than on actual expertise. In another example, a person might argue that a particular political policy is correct because a well-known political leader supports it. They might say, this policy must be the right one because leader's name is in favor of it. While political leaders can be knowledgeable in their areas of expertise, their endorsement does not automatically make the policy the best option. The policy should be assessed based on evidence, facts, and how it addresses the issues at hand, not simply on the leader's support. The appeal to authority is often used because people tend to trust those with established credentials or recognition. We naturally look for experts to guide us in various fields, from science and medicine to politics and culture. However, it's important to remember that not all authority figures are experts in every area. For instance, a well-known actor might be great at playing roles in movies, but they may not have the necessary knowledge to speak authoritatively about climate change, despite their large following. When someone uses their fame or position to endorse a claim outside their area of expertise, it weakens the argument and misleads the audience. This fallacy can also be seen in academic or scientific contexts. A person might argue, this theory is true because Professor X, a respected academic in another field, supports it. While Professor X may be highly knowledgeable in their own area of study, their opinion on a different topic should be treated with the same level of scrutiny as anyone else's. Just because someone is an expert in one field doesn't mean they are automatically an expert in another. For example, a renowned physicist may not have the same level of expertise in biology, and their opinion on biological matters shouldn't be taken as fact without evidence. In some cases, the appeal to authority fallacy is based on the status of the person rather than their knowledge. A famous person or an expert in one field may be perceived as a reliable source of information, but their personal views on unrelated subjects may be irrelevant. For example, a popular actor may express an opinion on environmental policy. While their opinion may carry weight among their followers, it doesn't make them an expert on environmental science or policymaking. Just because they're well-known doesn't mean their endorsement or viewpoint is based on credible research or evidence. Appeal to authority can also be a tactic used in advertising. Companies often use experts or celebrities to endorse products, but the authority being cited may not be relevant to the product being sold. For example, an advertisement for a brand of skincare products might feature a renowned dermatologist endorsing the products. While the dermatologist is an expert in skin health, they may not be involved in the specific product's development or testing, and their endorsement might not be enough to prove its effectiveness. It's important to look beyond the endorsement and assess whether the product itself is backed by research or scientific evidence. The appeal to authority can be particularly misleading when the authority being cited is not truly an expert in the subject being discussed. This can happen when people cite individuals who are famous in one field but not relevant to the discussion at hand. For example, a well-known business leader might make a statement about the environment, and their followers may blindly accept it because of their status in business. But business success doesn't necessarily translate to expertise in environmental science, and their opinions should be evaluated based on the evidence, not their position. This fallacy can also become a problem when multiple authorities disagree on an issue. Just because an expert says something doesn't mean it's true, and relying on the opinion of one authority figure over another can be misleading. For example, there may be multiple climate scientists with differing views on how to address climate change. Relying solely on the opinion of one scientist, especially if they're not the most prominent or if their opinion isn't backed by consensus, can lead to an incomplete understanding of the issue. It's important to approach arguments from authority with a healthy degree of skepticism. While experts in a given field should be listened to, their opinions should not be accepted without question. Critical thinking requires that we evaluate the evidence and reasoning behind claims, rather than relying solely on the authority of the person presenting them. We should always ask, what evidence supports this claim? Is the person citing an authority figure truly an expert in the field? Are there alternative viewpoints from other experts that should be considered? In discussions or debates, it's useful to ask questions that focus on the argument itself rather than the status of the person making it. For example, instead of saying, "But this expert agrees with me," it's more effective to say, "What evidence does this expert present to support their claim?" This helps shift the focus from the authority figure to the substance of the argument. The appeal to authority can be tempting because it's easier to rely on a respected figure's opinion than to do the work of evaluating the evidence yourself. But it's important to avoid this shortcut in reasoning. Real critical thinking involves considering all sides of an issue, examining the evidence, and being open to differing viewpoints. Even experts can be wrong or biased, and their authority should not be a substitute for careful reasoning and evidence. In the end, while authority figures can provide valuable insight, their words should never replace the need for evidence-based reasoning. When we rely too heavily on authority, we risk missing out on a deeper understanding of the issues at hand. It's up to each of us to approach claims with an open, critical mind and not to accept arguments simply because an authority figure says they're true. The false dilemma fallacy, also known as black and white thinking, occurs when someone presents an issue as having only two possible outcomes or choices, ignoring other potential options. This type of thinking simplifies complex situations, presenting them as clear-cut and binary when, in reality, the situation may have many more nuances. It's a way of framing an argument that forces people to choose between two extreme positions, leaving no room for compromise or alternative solutions. Imagine a political debate where one side argues, "You're either with us, supporting our policies, or you're against us, supporting the opposition." This type of statement sets up a false dilemma. It assumes that there are only two choices: support one side or support the other. It ignores the possibility that someone might disagree with certain aspects of both sides or might want to take a more moderate position. By limiting the choices to only two extremes, the speaker makes the situation appear more straightforward than it really is. The false dilemma can be a powerful tactic in discussions because it forces people into one of two corners, creating a sense of urgency and conflict. It removes the space for nuanced thinking and complex solutions. For example, someone might say, either we completely open up the economy right now, or we risk the collapse of our entire system. This creates a false choice, as there are other options that might involve a gradual reopening, safety measures, or targeted economic support that balances reopening with public health concerns. By presenting only the two extreme possibilities, the person making the argument pushes others to accept an oversimplified view of the issue. One common place where false dilemmas are used is in moral or ethical discussions. For instance, a person might say, either you support freedom of speech or you're against free expression. This argument assumes that there's no middle ground between fully supporting all speech and being opposed to free expression. In reality, there are many nuances to this issue. People can support freedom of speech while also acknowledging the need for certain limits, such as restrictions against hate speech or speech that incites violence. By framing the issue as an all-or-nothing proposition, the person using the false dilemma disregards those middle ground positions. This fallacy often comes up in debates about complex social issues, such as gun control or climate change. Someone might argue, you either want to protect the rights of gun owners, or you want to take away everyone's guns. This statement simplifies the issue to a false choice. It assumes that gun control supporters want to completely remove all firearms from the population, which isn't necessarily true. Many gun control advocates may simply want to implement regulations or restrictions to prevent violence while still allowing responsible gun ownership. By reducing the argument to a black and white issue, the person avoids discussing the range of possible policies and solutions. In personal relationships, false dilemmas can also appear. A common example is when someone says, you either love me or you don't care about me. This oversimplifies complex emotions and relationships. Love isn't a binary choice. There are many ways to show care and affection, and people can express love in different ways, including through actions, words, or gestures. By framing the relationship in terms of an all-or-nothing choice, the speaker ignores the many layers of emotion and behavior that exist in human relationships. This fallacy can be used strategically to manipulate others. By presenting only two choices, both of which seem undesirable or extreme, the person using the false dilemma may pressure others into choosing the option that best serves their own agenda. For example, a politician might say, either we pass this law now, or our country will fall apart. This sets up a false dilemma by implying that the only alternatives are to accept the proposed law or face disaster, without considering other potential solutions or compromises. It forces people to accept a decision under pressure, often without fully considering the other possibilities. The false dilemma is often used to create a sense of urgency or to polarize an issue. It simplifies a complex problem by framing it as a battle between two opposing forces. By creating a false sense of limited choices, it encourages people to make decisions based on fear or pressure, rather than careful analysis of the situation. It may also encourage people to take extreme positions, rather than finding middle ground or compromise. In some cases, the false dilemma can be an unconscious mistake, especially in emotionally charged situations. For example, during a heated argument, someone might say, you either agree with me or you don't care about our relationship. This oversimplifies the situation, ignoring the fact that a person can care deeply about a relationship but still disagree on specific issues. By presenting only two options, the speaker makes it difficult for the other person to express their point of view without feeling forced into one of the extremes. The false dilemma can also occur in debates about policies or societal issues. For example, someone might argue, either we keep increasing taxes on the rich, or the poor will continue to suffer. While increasing taxes on the wealthy may help address inequality, this ignores other possible solutions, such as improving education, creating more job opportunities, or addressing wage disparity. By framing the issue as a choice between only two extreme measures, the person avoids considering the full range of possible solutions and creates a false sense of urgency around their preferred approach. The problem with the false dilemma is that it oversimplifies complex issues. In reality, many problems have multiple facets, and solutions often involve a balance of different strategies. For example, a person might argue, either we protect jobs and lower taxes for businesses, or we help workers with higher wages and benefits. This is a false dilemma because it assumes that supporting businesses and supporting workers are mutually exclusive. In truth, policies can be designed to benefit both businesses and workers, such as by investing in worker training programs, raising the minimum wage while offering tax incentives to businesses, or ensuring that both economic growth and workers' well-being are prioritized. In everyday life, false dilemmas can also arise in simpler decisions. For example, someone might say, either you go out with me tonight, or you don't care about our friendship. This argument presents only two choices, ignoring the possibility that someone might care about the friendship but not be able to go out for other reasons, such as needing to rest or having other commitments. By presenting the situation as a black and white choice, the speaker makes it difficult for the other person to express a reasonable explanation or find an alternative solution. To avoid falling into the trap of false dilemmas, it's important to recognize that most issues are not binary. There are often many shades of gray in between the extremes, and it's crucial to consider all possible options and solutions. Rather than presenting a situation as having only two choices, it's better to think critically about the full range of possibilities and encourage open dialogue about all the potential outcomes. By acknowledging the complexity of a situation, we can make more informed decisions and engage in more productive conversations. In any debate, whether personal, political, or intellectual, it's essential to move away from black and white thinking and explore the variety of possible solutions or viewpoints. This helps to promote more nuanced, thoughtful discussions and leads to better, more effective decision-making. Recognizing the false dilemma fallacy allows us to see beyond the limited choices presented and opens up a broader range of possibilities for resolution. Circular reasoning, also known as begging the question, is a fallacy in which the conclusion of an argument is used as one of its premises. Essentially, the argument doesn't provide any real support for the conclusion. Instead, it simply restates the conclusion in different words. This creates a loop where the argument goes around in circles without offering any new evidence or reasoning to prove the point. It's a form of reasoning that fails to advance understanding because it relies on assuming the very thing it seeks to prove. For example, consider the statement, "God exists because the Bible says so, and the Bible is the Word of God." This is circular reasoning because the argument assumes that the Bible is true in order to prove that God exists, but the truth of the Bible is exactly what needs to be proven. The argument doesn't provide independent evidence for God's existence, but instead relies on the premise that the Bible, which claims God's existence, is already valid. The conclusion is already embedded in the premise, making the argument unconvincing to someone who does not already accept the Bible as an authority. Another example of circular reasoning can be found in the argument, "I know that I'm right because I'm never wrong." Here, the statement doesn't offer any actual proof for why the person is right. It merely asserts that their position is correct because they say so. The premise assumes the conclusion by simply claiming that the speaker is always correct without providing any reasoning for why they should be trusted on this occasion. Circular reasoning often appears in debates or discussions where someone is trying to convince others of a belief or idea that doesn't have sufficient evidence to stand on its own. For example, someone might say, "I believe that democracy is the best form of government because it's the most fair." This is circular reasoning if the argument relies on the assumption that democracy is fair without actually explaining why it is fair. The person assumes the fairness of democracy as part of the argument for why democracy is the best system, but they do not provide any independent support for the fairness of democracy itself. The fairness of democracy is assumed as true, which is precisely what the argument should be proving. Circular reasoning can be tricky because it often sounds convincing at first. When someone makes a statement that asserts their conclusion as a premise, they might do so in a way that makes it appear logical. The problem is that the argument doesn't provide any new information or evidence that would convince someone who disagrees. It simply repeats the conclusion in different terms, creating an illusion of proof. This can lead people to accept the conclusion without questioning the reasoning behind it, especially in discussions where there's little pushback or critical questioning. In everyday conversations, circular reasoning can often be seen in debates about personal beliefs. For instance, someone might say, "I believe that this is the best brand of shoes because it's the most popular brand." This is circular reasoning because the argument doesn't explain why the shoes are the best. It simply states that their popularity makes them the best. The conclusion that the shoes are the best is already embedded in the premise that they are the most popular. The argument doesn't provide any other reasons or evidence, like the quality of the shoes or the satisfaction of customers, to justify the claim. Another common example can be found in advertising. For example, a commercial might say, "This is the most trusted toothpaste because everyone trusts it." This argument doesn't explain why people trust the toothpaste or what makes it reliable. It simply assumes that the trust people have in the product is proof of its trustworthiness. The argument goes in circles, offering no new information beyond the claim that the toothpaste is trusted because people trust it. There's no deeper reasoning or evidence to support why the product should be trusted beyond the fact that it is trusted. Circular reasoning can also be seen in some philosophical arguments. For instance, someone might argue, "The law of attraction works because it brings good things into your life when you believe in it." This argument assumes that the law of attraction is effective because it produces good outcomes, but it doesn't provide independent evidence of its effectiveness. It simply assumes the conclusion that believing in the law of attraction leads to good things, without offering any reason why believing in it causes positive results. The argument is self-referential and circular because it uses the claim that good things happen as proof that the law works, without showing why or how it works. This fallacy can be particularly frustrating because it can be hard to pinpoint at first. Someone might say, "I know my point is correct because I've done a lot of research on this," but without offering any details about the research or how it supports their argument, they are essentially saying, "I am right because I say I'm right." The argument doesn't provide any independent evidence or reasoning to demonstrate the truth of the point. Instead, it relies on the authority of the speaker and the assumption that their conclusion is already valid, which doesn't move the conversation forward or offer any real justification for the argument. Circular reasoning is also common in situations where people have strong personal beliefs. For example, in a discussion about why a certain lifestyle is the best choice, someone might say, "This lifestyle is the best because it makes people happy." If the argument simply assumes that people are happy with this lifestyle and that happiness is proof of its superiority, it becomes a circular argument. The claim of happiness is used as evidence for the lifestyle's superiority, but it doesn't provide any other reason for why this lifestyle should be considered the best. It assumes the very thing that needs to be proven. To avoid circular reasoning, it's important to ensure that an argument provides new, independent reasons for the conclusion, not just restates the conclusion in different words. Instead of assuming that the conclusion is true and building the argument from that assumption, the reasoning should provide evidence or logic that leads to the conclusion. For instance, if someone argues that democracy is the best form of government, they should explain why democracy is fair, how it ensures freedom, and why it leads to better outcomes, rather than simply assuming that democracy is fair and using that as evidence for why it is the best. When analyzing arguments, it's important to look for circular reasoning because it can often go unnoticed, especially when the argument is framed in a convincing or authoritative way. If a conclusion is simply restated as a premise, without providing any new evidence, it's a sign that the argument is not actually offering proof. It's just going in circles. Identifying circular reasoning allows us to ask better questions and push for deeper, more thoughtful arguments that stand on solid ground, rather than on assumptions that are never tested or justified. The post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, often shortened to post hoc, occurs when someone assumes that because one event follows another, the first event must have caused the second. This type of reasoning is a mistake because just because two events happen in sequence doesn't mean one caused the other. The fallacy relies on the assumption that time order implies a cause and effect relationship, without any evidence to support that assumption. An example of post hoc reasoning is if someone claims, "I wore my lucky socks today, and I won the game, so my socks must have caused my victory." This argument is based on the idea that because the game was won after wearing the lucky socks, the socks must have been the cause of the win. However, there are many other factors that could have influenced the outcome of the game, such as skill, strategy, or even luck. But the post hoc reasoning focuses solely on the fact that the socks were worn first and the game was won second. This leads to a false conclusion that the socks caused the win, when in reality, the timing of the two events is merely coincidental. In everyday life, we see this kind of reasoning in many places, especially when people try to explain events or outcomes in a way that fits their beliefs or experiences. For instance, someone might argue, "Every time I go for a jog in the morning, it rains later in the day. I must be causing the rain." This is another example of post hoc reasoning. Just because the jogging happened before the rain doesn't mean the jog caused the rain. The rain is likely a result of meteorological factors that have nothing to do with when the person went for a jog. In the realm of medicine, post hoc reasoning can sometimes lead to mistaken conclusions. For example, suppose someone takes a particular herbal supplement for a week and then recovers from a cold. They might claim, "I took this supplement and I got better, so the supplement must have cured my cold." While the timing of the recovery may coincide with taking the supplement, there are many other factors to consider. It's possible the person would have recovered on their own, or perhaps the illness was mild enough to resolve naturally. But by assuming a cause and effect relationship simply because one event followed another, they fall into the post hoc fallacy. This kind of reasoning is especially prevalent in superstitions and folk beliefs. For example, a person might say, "I carried a rabbit's foot with me to the interview and I got the job. The rabbit's foot must have brought me good luck." Again, the argument assumes that the event that occurred after carrying the rabbit's foot, getting the job, was caused by the foot itself. In reality, the person might have been qualified for the job and performed well in the interview, but the rabbit's foot has no actual influence on the outcome. The post hoc fallacy mistakenly links the two events because they occurred in succession. Post hoc reasoning can be very persuasive because it seems to make logical sense at first glance. After all, when two events happen in sequence, it's easy to think that one must have caused the other. However, making this assumption without any supporting evidence is problematic because it ignores the possibility that the two events are unrelated or that other factors played a role. For example, in politics, a politician might say, "The economy improved after I passed my tax cuts, so the tax cuts must have helped the economy." This argument is a classic example of post hoc reasoning. While the economy may have improved after the tax cuts, it's important to consider other factors that could have contributed to the improvement, such as global market trends, consumer behavior, or changes in technology. The improvement in the economy might have happened regardless of the tax cuts, but by focusing solely on the timing of the two events, the politician is making a post hoc claim about cause and effect. Similarly, when evaluating historical events, post hoc reasoning can sometimes lead to skewed conclusions. If a leader makes a major policy change, and then the country experiences a period of peace or prosperity, it might be tempting to conclude that the policy change caused the positive outcomes. However, without considering all the contributing factors, such as international relations, social movements, or other internal changes, the post hoc reasoning oversimplifies the situation. The policy change may not have been the true cause of the outcome, and other, less visible factors could have played a significant role. In the world of science, post hoc reasoning can lead to erroneous conclusions about causality. Suppose a researcher observes that every time a certain medication is taken, a patient's symptoms improve. The researcher might jump to the conclusion that the medication caused the improvement without considering other possibilities, such as natural variations in the disease or the placebo effect. Scientific rigor requires more than just observing that one event follows another. It requires controlled studies, evidence, and careful analysis to establish causality. Jumping to conclusions based on post hoc reasoning can lead to false claims and poor decision-making. In some cases, the post hoc fallacy is used intentionally to manipulate or persuade others. For instance, marketers often make post hoc claims to sell products. A commercial might show someone taking a particular brand of vitamins and then quickly becoming more energetic or successful. The ad implies that the vitamins cause the positive change, but in reality, the connection between taking the vitamins and the outcome is not proven. The commercial relies on the post hoc fallacy to create a false impression of cause and effect. It's also common to see post hoc reasoning in debates about social or cultural issues. For example, someone might argue, Crime rates increased after this new law was passed, so the law must have caused the rise in crime. This argument ignores the possibility that other factors, such as economic conditions, changes in law enforcement practices, or social movements, contributed to the increase in crime. By focusing solely on the timing of the law's passage, the argument assumes a causal relationship that may not exist. To avoid the post hoc fallacy, it's important to remember that just because two events occur in sequence doesn't mean one caused the other. Correlation does not imply causation. There could be a number of other factors at play that are responsible for the outcomes observed. When analyzing cause and effect, it's crucial to look at the bigger picture and consider all the possible variables, rather than jumping to conclusions based on the order in which events occur. Understanding the limitations of post hoc reasoning helps us make better decisions and form stronger, more logical arguments. Instead of assuming that one event caused another simply because it happened first, we need to seek evidence and investigate all the factors that could have contributed to the outcome. By doing so, we can avoid falling into the trap of post hoc reasoning and gain a deeper, more accurate understanding of the world around us. The slippery slope fallacy occurs when someone argues that a relatively small first step will lead to a chain of events with dire, often catastrophic, consequences, without providing evidence to support such a dramatic outcome. This type of reasoning suggests that if one thing happens, then it will inevitably lead to something much worse, but it doesn't actually demonstrate why this progression is likely. It's a way of scaring people into rejecting a proposal by suggesting that the initial action will trigger an unstoppable and disastrous series of events. For example, imagine a debate about legalizing marijuana. One person might argue, if we legalize marijuana, next we'll be legalizing harder drugs like heroin or cocaine, and that will destroy our society. This is a slippery slope argument because it assumes that legalizing marijuana will inevitably lead to the legalization of more dangerous substances, even though there's no evidence to support that such a progression will happen. The argument jumps to a worst-case scenario without proving why marijuana legalization would cause that outcome. In a political context, the slippery slope fallacy can be used to argue against policies that are perceived as the beginning of a dangerous trend. For instance, if a government proposes measures to regulate gun ownership, an opponent might say, if we pass these regulations, next they'll want to take away everyone's guns. This argument assumes that even small changes or regulations will lead to a much more extreme outcome, like complete confiscation of firearms. However, there's no evidence to show that regulating guns will automatically lead to such a drastic measure. It is simply a fear-driven argument that exaggerates the consequences of a single action. In some cases, the slippery slope fallacy is used to oppose changes in social or cultural norms. Consider a debate over marriage equality. Someone might argue, if we allow same-sex marriage, next people will want to marry animals or inanimate objects, and that will destroy the institution of marriage. This argument takes an initial change, legalizing same-sex marriage, and suggests that it will inevitably lead to extreme and absurd outcomes. It relies on fear and speculation rather than evidence, and it assumes a slippery slope from one action to an unreasonable conclusion without showing why the outcome is likely. Slippery slope reasoning also appears in discussions about personal freedoms. For example, in the context of public health measures, someone might argue, if we allow the government to mandate masks, next they'll be telling us what we can and can't do in our own homes. This argument suggests that one small restriction will quickly escalate into a wide-reaching infringement on personal freedoms. While it's valid to discuss the potential for government overreach, claiming that a single measure will inevitably lead to a broad and catastrophic loss of freedoms without evidence is a slippery slope fallacy. It doesn't consider the possibility that checks and balances, public debate, and legal safeguards could prevent such a drastic outcome. The slippery slope argument can also be seen in debates about technology and its impact on society. For instance, someone might say, if we allow people to use facial recognition technology, it will eventually lead to constant surveillance and the complete loss of privacy. While there are legitimate concerns about privacy, claiming that one use of technology will inevitably result in an extreme, privacy-invading society is a slippery slope argument. It doesn't consider how regulations, oversight, and public resistance could mitigate these risks. It assumes the worst possible outcome without proving why it would happen. Slippery slope reasoning is powerful because it appeals to people's fears of the unknown. It's easy to imagine extreme consequences when we're unsure about how something might unfold, and the argument often focuses on the worst-case scenario. However, the fallacy lies in the lack of evidence that the feared consequences will actually occur. Just because one thing happens doesn't mean that it will automatically lead to something worse, and the argument fails to demonstrate why the next step is inevitable. It's important to recognize the difference between genuine concern about a possible chain of events and the use of slippery slope reasoning. There are instances where changes do lead to unintended consequences, but the slippery slope fallacy doesn't offer a valid explanation of why these consequences are certain. Instead, it simply suggests that one step will lead to disaster without any supporting evidence or logical reasoning. For example, imagine a company implements a new policy that limits the number of vacation days employees can take. A worker might say, "If we allow this policy to pass, next they'll reduce our pay, and eventually we'll all be working for minimum wage." While this could be a genuine concern about a potential trend, it's also an example of slippery slope reasoning if the person doesn't provide evidence that reducing vacation days will necessarily lead to pay cuts. They are jumping to the worst-case scenario without showing why that outcome is a logical consequence of the policy change. Similarly, in environmental debates, someone might argue, "If we allow this one small factory to pollute the air, soon all factories will be allowed to pollute, and the planet will be ruined." This is a slippery slope argument because it assumes that allowing one factory to pollute will inevitably lead to widespread environmental destruction, but it fails to provide evidence for why that escalation would happen. It doesn't consider the possibility of regulations, enforcement, or technological advances that could prevent such an outcome. The slippery slope fallacy is also prevalent in legal arguments. For example, someone might argue, "If we allow gay couples to adopt children, next we'll be allowing single people to adopt children, and that will be damaging to the child's upbringing." This argument makes an unsupported leap from the acceptance of same-sex adoption to a broader change in adoption policies. It suggests that one decision will lead to a series of other undesirable changes, but it doesn't provide evidence to support that these changes will occur or that they would be harmful. It's an example of using fear of a slippery slope to oppose a reasonable policy change. In all of these cases, the slippery slope fallacy relies on speculation about what will happen next, rather than a logical or evidence-based explanation of why it will happen. It plays on fear, presenting an exaggerated and often unrealistic chain of events that distracts from the actual discussion at hand. The problem with slippery slope reasoning is that it avoids addressing the specific issue or proposing a solid argument based on facts and evidence. Instead, it jumps to an extreme conclusion without justifying why the feared outcome is likely or inevitable. When evaluating arguments, it's important to question whether the slippery slope reasoning is being used. We should ask, what evidence is there that this sequence of events will happen? Are there other factors or safeguards that could prevent the feared outcome? Without a solid explanation of why one step will necessarily lead to a chain of negative consequences, slippery slope arguments should be treated with skepticism. It's crucial to focus on the merits of each individual step or policy and evaluate the possible risks and benefits based on evidence, rather than relying on fear-driven speculation about what might happen next. The bandwagon fallacy occurs when someone assumes that something is true, right, or good simply because it is popular or widely accepted. This type of reasoning is based on the idea that if many people believe or do something, it must be correct or valid. However, popularity does not necessarily equate to truth or correctness. The bandwagon fallacy disregards the need for critical thinking, evidence, or logical reasoning, and instead relies on the mere fact that something has gained widespread attention or support. For example, imagine a group of people all agreeing that a particular celebrity's fashion choices are the best. One person might then argue, "Everyone is wearing this style, so it must be the best." This is a classic bandwagon argument. Just because many people are following a trend doesn't mean that it is the best choice for everyone or that it is objectively the right style. The bandwagon fallacy ignores individual preferences, quality, and other factors that could be more important than popularity. In everyday life, we see this fallacy in many forms. For instance, when a new diet fad emerges and many people start following it, others might feel compelled to try it as well, saying, "So many people are doing it, it must work." This line of thinking assumes that the widespread popularity of the diet proves its effectiveness, but it overlooks the fact that many people may simply be jumping on the bandwagon without understanding the science or reasoning behind it. The fact that something is popular doesn't make it the best or most effective choice for everyone. The bandwagon fallacy is also common in the world of politics. During elections, candidates often gain support because they are popular among certain groups or because their views align with the majority. However, supporting a candidate simply because they are popular, rather than because of their policies or qualifications, is an example of the bandwagon fallacy. For instance, someone might say, "This candidate is leading in the polls, so they must be the best choice." This reasoning ignores the importance of critically evaluating a candidate's stance on important issues or their ability to lead effectively. Just because a candidate is popular doesn't mean they are the right person for the job. In the business world, companies often rely on the bandwagon fallacy to boost sales. For example, a product might be marketed as the most popular choice, or the #1 product in its category. Consumers may then decide to purchase it simply because others are buying it, without considering whether the product truly meets their needs or offers the best value. This fallacy takes advantage of people's desire to fit in or be part of a larger group, rather than encouraging them to make decisions based on logic and individual preferences. The bandwagon fallacy can also be seen in social media trends. People often participate in viral challenges, share popular memes, or follow trends simply because they are widespread. For example, someone might post a viral video or share a trending hashtag without truly understanding its meaning or implications, just because it is popular. In this case, the popularity of the trend becomes the primary reason for participation, rather than any thoughtful consideration of its value or relevance. One of the reasons the bandwagon fallacy is so persuasive is that it plays on the human desire for social acceptance. People often want to be part of the group, and following popular trends is a way to fit in. This desire to belong can cloud judgment and lead people to make decisions based on what others are doing, rather than on their own independent reasoning. It's easier to follow the crowd than to stand alone, especially when the crowd seems to be moving in the same direction. For example, in the workplace, employees may adopt certain behaviors or practices simply because they are common within the company, even if they are not the most efficient or effective. Someone might say, "Everyone else in the office is staying late to finish work, so I guess I should too." This is an example of the bandwagon fallacy, as the decision to stay late is based on what others are doing rather than considering whether it is the best way to work. The fact that everyone else is doing something doesn't mean it is the right choice for the individual. Another example can be found in the field of education. Students may choose certain subjects or career paths because they are popular or widely accepted, without considering their personal interests or aptitudes. A student might say, "Everyone in my class is going into engineering, so it must be the best career choice." This type of thinking overlooks the fact that not everyone has the same strengths or passions, and choosing a career path based solely on popularity can lead to dissatisfaction or failure in the long term. The bandwagon fallacy also plays a significant role in advertising. Companies often use the idea that a product is popular to persuade consumers to buy it. For example, a commercial might claim, "Millions of customers can't be wrong." The message implies that because so many people have bought the product, it must be a good choice. This reasoning ignores the fact that popularity does not necessarily mean quality, and many people might simply be influenced by the product's marketing or by others' opinions, rather than making an informed decision based on the product's merits. In some cases, the bandwagon fallacy can be harmful because it encourages conformity and discourages independent thinking. When people simply follow the crowd, they may miss out on better options that are not as widely known or accepted. For example, in the world of technology, people may buy the latest smartphone model simply because it is popular, without considering whether it truly meets their needs or offers the best features. The desire to own what everyone else is using can prevent individuals from exploring alternatives that might better suit their preferences or budget. This fallacy can also affect how we view social issues. When a particular stance or viewpoint becomes popular, others may adopt it without critically evaluating the issue. For example, a person might support a particular social movement because it is trendy, without fully understanding the complexities or goals of the movement. In such cases, the popularity of the cause, rather than its merits or the thoughtfulness behind it, becomes the driving force for support. It's important to recognize when the bandwagon fallacy is at play, as it can lead to poor decision-making. Rather than simply going along with what is popular, we should take the time to evaluate the reasoning behind the choices we make. This involves asking whether something is truly the best option, based on facts, evidence, and personal judgment, rather than assuming it is right just because it is widely accepted or followed. By thinking critically and independently, we can avoid falling into the trap of the bandwagon fallacy and make better, more informed decisions. The red herring fallacy occurs when someone introduces irrelevant information into an argument in order to distract from the main issue. This tactic sidetracks the conversation, leading people away from the actual topic at hand. Instead of addressing the core argument, the speaker diverts attention to something that may seem related but is, in fact, unrelated. The goal is often to avoid a difficult question or to steer the conversation in a direction where the speaker feels more comfortable. For example, during a debate about climate change, one person might argue, "We need to focus on reducing carbon emissions to combat climate change." In response, the other person might say, "But think about all the jobs that would be lost if we switched to renewable energy. The economy would suffer." This is a red herring. While job loss may be an important issue to discuss, it distracts from the original argument about the need to reduce carbon emissions. The introduction of economic concerns doesn't address the validity of climate change or the need for action, but it shifts the focus to a different issue that could sidetrack the conversation. Red herrings are often used in debates when someone is unable to effectively respond to the argument. Instead of confronting the difficult issue, the speaker throws in a tangent or an unrelated point to avoid giving a direct answer. For example, in a discussion about gun control, a person might argue, "We need stricter gun laws to reduce violence." Someone opposing the idea might reply, "But what about all the violent video games kids are playing today? They're the real problem." The video game argument, while it may have some relevance in a broader discussion about violence, doesn't address the specific issue of gun control. It's a distraction that leads away from the core issue. This type of reasoning is effective because it can be emotionally charged or feel relevant at first, which makes people momentarily forget the original argument. It's easy for someone to hear a compelling but unrelated point and lose track of the initial topic. In the example about video games, many people have strong feelings about the influence of media on behavior. By introducing this topic, the person distracting from the gun control argument may momentarily shift the focus to a different debate, one that is easier for them to argue or more aligned with their beliefs. In politics, red herrings are common during debates, especially when the issues are complex or controversial. Politicians may often introduce red herrings to deflect attention from their own shortcomings or controversial positions. For example, when asked about their plans to address healthcare, a politician might respond, "What we really need to focus on is our national security. We have threats abroad that we can't ignore." This response doesn't answer the original question about healthcare, but instead shifts the conversation to security, an issue that might be more politically charged or easier to talk about. The red herring in this case serves to avoid addressing the tough questions about healthcare policy. In legal arguments, red herrings are often introduced to confuse or mislead. During a trial, a defense attorney might argue, "The witness who is testifying against my client has a criminal record, so we can't trust anything they say." This distracts from the actual evidence of the case and focuses instead on the character of the witness. While the witness's history might be relevant in some cases, it may not necessarily affect the truth of their testimony. The goal of such a red herring is to shift the jury's attention away from the facts and to discredit the witness on unrelated grounds. In personal relationships, red herrings can also appear in arguments. For instance, if two people are discussing a disagreement about household responsibilities, one person might say, "I do all the cleaning around here and you never help out." The other person might respond, "Well, you never even thank me for the hard work I do at my job." This shifts the conversation away from the topic of household chores and introduces a new issue about gratitude, which is unrelated to the original point. The response doesn't address the problem but instead creates a diversion by focusing on a different emotional concern. The red herring fallacy is particularly effective because it preys on the human tendency to be easily distracted by emotionally charged or attention-grabbing topics. People naturally gravitate toward information that elicits a strong emotional response or that appears relevant on the surface. Red herrings can divert attention and cause people to forget the core issue they were initially discussing. In debates or discussions, this tactic can undermine productive conversations by leading them into less relevant territory. This kind of distraction is also effective in advertising. Companies often use red herrings in their campaigns by emphasizing an aspect of their product that isn't actually central to its value. For example, an ad for a new car might focus heavily on the car's color options or entertainment system, even though the car's safety features or fuel efficiency might be more important to the consumer. The company distracts potential buyers from considering the most relevant factors by highlighting something that is less important but potentially more appealing or easier to market. The problem with red herrings is that they prevent constructive debate and problem solving. Instead of tackling the real issues, the conversation is derailed by irrelevant points. This not only wastes time but also creates confusion, making it harder to reach meaningful conclusions or find solutions. When we fall for red herrings, we lose sight of the important points and end up in circular discussions that don't get us anywhere. To avoid falling into the trap of a red herring, it's important to stay focused on the original argument. If a discussion seems to veer off course, it's helpful to gently steer it back to the main issue. For example, if someone introduces a red herring by talking about video games in the context of gun control, you might say, "I understand that video games are a concern for some, but let's focus on the gun control issue right now. We can talk about other factors later." By keeping the conversation grounded and not allowing distractions to take over, we can have more productive discussions and make sure the real issues are being addressed. In debates, it's also essential to recognize when someone is using a red herring. If someone introduces irrelevant points or tangents that don't address the argument, it's important to call attention to it and refocus on the core issue. By doing so, we can ensure that the discussion stays on track and that the arguments made are relevant and meaningful. The red herring fallacy is a common tool in discussions, but recognizing and addressing it helps to keep conversations honest and productive. It's important to remember that just because something sounds important or is emotionally charged doesn't mean it's the issue that needs to be resolved. Staying focused on the main argument allows for better decision-making, clearer communication, and more effective problem-solving. The appeal to emotion fallacy occurs when someone uses emotional manipulation to persuade others, rather than presenting logical arguments or facts. This fallacy relies on stirring up feelings like fear, pity, anger, or guilt to influence a person's opinion or decision, without addressing the real substance of the issue. The goal is to provoke an emotional response that overrides rational thinking. While emotions can be important in human decision-making, they shouldn't be used to replace sound reasoning or evidence when making an argument. One common example of an appeal to emotion is when someone uses fear to sway others. For instance, a politician might argue, "If we don't pass this law, crime will rise, and our streets will no longer be safe." This argument is designed to stir fear, but it doesn't provide any evidence or reasoning to explain why passing the law would necessarily lead to reduced crime. The focus is on making people afraid, rather than presenting a reasoned argument based on facts, studies, or other evidence that would support the law's effectiveness. Another type of emotional appeal uses pity. For example, a charity might say, "Think of the starving children in this country. If you don't donate now, their suffering will continue." While it's important to acknowledge the real suffering of others, this statement attempts to manipulate people into donating by invoking a sense of guilt or sympathy, rather than giving them the chance to make an informed decision based on the actual impact of their donation. The emotional appeal here may make someone feel guilty for not donating, but it doesn't provide a logical or well-supported argument for why they should give their money. Appeals to emotion can also take the form of anger or outrage. For example, during a debate on social issues, someone might say, "How can anyone with a conscience support this policy? It's morally wrong and harms the vulnerable." This approach aims to provoke anger by framing the opposing view as morally reprehensible. Instead of discussing the policy in a calm, reasoned way, the speaker is trying to get people to react emotionally, perhaps out of a sense of moral outrage, without carefully considering the facts or the potential complexities of the issue. Sometimes, the appeal to emotion comes in the form of a personal story designed to trigger empathy. For instance, a person might say, "I personally know someone who has struggled with this issue, and their life has been ruined. How can you not care?" While personal stories can be powerful and help to humanize an issue, they can also be manipulative if they are used to replace reasoned arguments. This approach can make people feel sorry for the individual involved, but it doesn't necessarily provide any compelling evidence or reasoning for the broader point being made. The individual story can cloud judgment and overshadow more relevant, logical considerations. Appeals to emotion are also common in advertising. For example, a commercial for a car might show a family driving through a scenic countryside, smiling and laughing. The message isn't about the car's specific features, but rather the emotions associated with owning it: happiness, freedom, and connection. While the ad might make viewers feel good about the idea of owning the car, it doesn't provide any substantial information about why the car is a good choice based on its performance, price, safety features, or other important factors. The emotional appeal is used to create a positive feeling, which can influence purchasing decisions, even if the product isn't the best choice for the buyer. One reason that the appeal to emotion fallacy is effective is that emotions can override logical thinking. When people are emotionally invested in an issue, they may be less likely to critically evaluate the reasoning behind an argument. For example, when a political candidate uses fear-mongering tactics, such as saying that voting for their opponent will lead to disaster, it can make voters feel anxious and make them more likely to support the candidate, not because of logical policy proposals, but because they are trying to avoid the fear of the predicted disaster. Appeals to emotion can also work because they often tap into deeply held values, beliefs, or fears. For instance, a message that plays on people's fear of losing their rights or freedoms can be very persuasive because it resonates with their core values. Similarly, an appeal to someone's sense of justice or fairness might make them more likely to support a cause, not because of a logical argument, but because they are emotionally moved by the perceived injustice. Despite their effectiveness in influencing decisions, emotional appeals are not always a reliable guide to the truth. They can lead to decisions that are based on fear, guilt, or anger rather than careful analysis. For example, a politician might claim that a particular policy is needed to protect national security, and while this might evoke fear of external threats, it's essential to ask whether the policy is actually supported by facts and evidence. The emotional appeal might cloud people's judgment, leading them to support something without fully understanding the consequences or whether it will actually achieve the desired result. The danger of the appeal to emotion is that it can lead people to make decisions based on feelings rather than reason, which can have serious consequences. For example, a company might advertise a product with an emotional appeal, such as focusing on how much better a person's life will be if they buy the product. While the ad may create a positive emotional response, it might not address whether the product is truly necessary or whether it will have the intended benefits. The emotional pull can overshadow more practical concerns, such as whether the product is the best fit for the buyer's needs. In debates about social or political issues, emotional appeals can also lead to polarization. When people become emotionally invested in an issue, they may become more entrenched in their views and less open to hearing opposing arguments. For example, in the debate over healthcare, one side might use an emotional appeal by showing images of people suffering from inadequate healthcare, while the other side might use fear by suggesting that reform will lead to economic collapse. Both of these tactics rely on stirring up emotions to sway people, but they prevent a balanced, reasoned discussion of the actual policy and its potential consequences. It's important to recognize when an argument is using an appeal to emotion, as it often signals that the person making the argument doesn't have a strong or well-supported case. While emotions are an important part of human life and can certainly influence our decisions, they should not be used to substitute for logic and evidence. When presented with an argument, it's crucial to assess whether the points being made are based on sound reasoning and facts, or if they are simply trying to provoke an emotional response. By focusing on logical reasoning, we can make better decisions and avoid being manipulated by emotional appeals that don't stand up to scrutiny. The Quoque fallacy, also known as the U2 fallacy, occurs when someone responds to criticism not by addressing the criticism itself, but by pointing out that the person making the criticism is guilty of the same thing. Instead of engaging with the argument or defending their own position, the person deflects the criticism by accusing the other person of hypocrisy. While this may feel like a valid response in the moment, it doesn't actually address the original issue. It shifts the focus away from the matter at hand and onto the behavior of the person making the accusation, often without resolving the core problem. For example, imagine a person is criticizing their friend for smoking, saying, "You shouldn't smoke. It's bad for your health." In response, the smoker might say, "Well, you drink soda all the time. You're not exactly the picture of health either." This is a classic example of the Quoque fallacy. Instead of addressing the health risks associated with smoking, the smoker deflects by pointing out that the person making the criticism is also engaging in unhealthy behavior, thereby diverting the conversation from the issue of smoking to the critic's soda consumption. This type of reasoning is common in everyday arguments. Consider a parent telling their teenager, "You should stop procrastinating and get your homework done on time." The teenager might reply, "But you're always putting off things you need to do, like cleaning the garage." In this case, the teenager isn't addressing the issue of procrastination, but instead, they are trying to avoid the criticism by accusing the parent of the same behavior. While it's true that the parent may sometimes procrastinate, this doesn't make the teenager's procrastination acceptable. The teenager is deflecting attention away from their own actions and onto the perceived hypocrisy of the parent. The Quoque fallacy often arises in political debates. For example, if one politician accuses another of corruption, the accused might respond, "Well, your party has had corruption scandals too, so why are you pointing fingers?" This response doesn't actually address the original charge of corruption but shifts the focus to the behavior of the critic's party. This tactic distracts from the issue of corruption and redirects the discussion to the actions of others, which doesn't resolve the original accusation. Even if the critic's party has committed similar acts, it doesn't make the accused politician's actions right. The argument is deflecting responsibility rather than addressing the core issue. This fallacy can also appear in discussions about ethics or morality. Suppose someone is arguing against a company's practices of exploiting workers in developing countries, and the company's representative replies, "But you shop at big box stores that pay low wages too." This response ignores the original argument about worker exploitation and instead attacks the person making the criticism. It doesn't address whether the company's practices are wrong, but rather deflects the conversation by pointing to the critic's own actions. While it's valid to discuss one's own role in supporting systems that contribute to exploitation, deflecting the conversation to someone else's behavior doesn't excuse the practice of the company. The Quoque fallacy is sometimes used to avoid accountability. Instead of dealing with a problematic issue head-on, the person accused of wrongdoing tries to undermine the legitimacy of the criticism by pointing out that others are equally guilty. For example, a person who has been caught cheating on their partner might respond, "But you cheated on me last year, so why are you upset with me now?" This response shifts the focus from the person's current wrongdoing to past actions. It is an attempt to deflect criticism by accusing the other person of being equally at fault. However, this doesn't excuse or justify their own behavior. Just because someone else has made a mistake doesn't mean that the current issue should be ignored or dismissed. In discussions about environmental issues, the Quoque fallacy often emerges. For example, someone may argue, "We need to take action to reduce carbon emissions and combat climate change." In response, the other person might say, "But you drive a gas-guzzling car, so why are you telling me how to reduce my carbon footprint?" This response shifts the focus to the critic's actions instead of engaging with the argument about the importance of reducing carbon emissions. While it may be valid to point out that the critic is not perfect, this deflection doesn't address the need for collective action to address climate change. The issue with the Quoque fallacy is that it doesn't address the substance of the argument being made. Instead of engaging with the actual issue, whether it's the dangers of smoking, the ethics of corporate practices, the responsibilities of public officials, or any other topic, the focus is shifted onto the supposed hypocrisy of the critic. Even if the critic is guilty of the same or similar behavior, this doesn't make the criticized behavior acceptable or right. The original argument or issue is left unresolved, and the deflection doesn't provide a valid reason for why the criticized action is justified. This fallacy can be particularly effective in deflecting blame or making someone feel guilty for criticizing. It plays on the human tendency to want to deflect blame and avoid being held accountable for one's own actions. In some cases, it can be tempting to use the two Quoque fallacy to avoid facing up to one's own behavior or to distract others from an uncomfortable conversation. However, it's important to recognize when this type of argument is being used, as it can derail a productive discussion and prevent resolution of the underlying issue. The key to avoiding the two Quoque fallacy is to focus on addressing the issue at hand rather than shifting blame or pointing out hypocrisy. If someone is criticized for a particular behavior, the correct response is to either acknowledge the criticism and explain why the behavior was justified, or to provide a reasonable defense based on facts and evidence. Responding with "you too" doesn't engage with the issue but rather tries to deflect responsibility or shift the conversation away from the original point. For instance, if someone is told that they are not living up to certain standards, the response should focus on whether the behavior being criticized is wrong or right, rather than attacking the critic. If a politician is accused of corruption, the focus should be on whether their actions were corrupt, rather than deflecting by pointing out corruption in the opposing party. Similarly, in personal relationships, if someone is criticized for a particular action, such as breaking a promise, they should address the substance of the criticism, not respond by pointing out that the other person has also broken promises. Ultimately, the two Quoque fallacy can prevent meaningful discussions and hinder problem solving. It shifts the focus away from the issue at hand and into a cycle of blame, rather than fostering an environment where both sides can engage in constructive conversation and find solutions. Recognizing and addressing this fallacy can help ensure that discussions remain focused on the core issue, leading to more productive and thoughtful exchanges. The no True Scotsman fallacy occurs when someone changes the criteria or definition of a group in order to exclude counterexamples that might challenge their argument. Instead of addressing the example or evidence that contradicts their claim, they simply adjust the conditions of the group so that the example no longer fits, even though it might have previously. This tactic is a way of defending a generalization by narrowing the group definition to protect the original claim, but it doesn't actually engage with the opposing evidence or address the issue at hand. For example, suppose someone argues, "No Scotsman puts sugar in their porridge." Then, if another person provides an example of a Scotsman who does put sugar in their porridge, the first person might reply, "Well, no true Scotsman would put sugar in their porridge." By changing the criteria for what it means to be a true Scotsman, the original claim is shielded from criticism. Instead of acknowledging the possibility that some Scotsmen might put sugar in their porridge, the person simply adjusts the definition of what constitutes a true member of the group, making the original claim impossible to disprove. This type of reasoning often occurs in debates about identity or membership in particular groups, especially when someone is trying to defend an idealized or oversimplified version of the group. It's an attempt to protect a belief or assertion by dismissing counterexamples rather than engaging with them directly. The problem with this approach is that it avoids a genuine discussion and creates a moving target that can't be meaningfully debated. Another common example can be found in discussions about religion. Someone might say, "No true Christian would ever commit such an act of violence." If someone points out that a person who identifies as Christian has committed such an act, the response might be, "Well, that person wasn't a true Christian." In this case, the definition of what it means to be a true Christian is being adjusted to exclude anyone whose actions don't align with the speaker's idealized version of the faith. Rather than confronting the complexity of religious identity or addressing the contradiction, the person using this fallacy simply redefines the group to ensure that the counterexample is excluded. The no True Scotsman fallacy can also be found in political debates. For instance, someone might claim, "No true patriot would support this law," implying that anyone who supports the law isn't a true patriot. If a person who is widely recognized as a patriot supports the law, the response might be, "That person is not a true patriot then." In this case, the definition of patriot is adjusted to exclude anyone whose actions don't fit the speaker's viewpoint. This allows the speaker to maintain their argument without dealing with the actual complexities or nuances of the situation. This fallacy can also appear in discussions about race or nationality. Suppose someone argues, No true American would ever support such a policy. If an American citizen supports that policy, the person making the argument might simply say, well, that person isn't really American. Again, the criteria for being a true member of the group, whether that's being American, British, or part of any other group, are being changed in order to dismiss counterexamples. The focus shifts from the actual qualities or actions of the people involved to an arbitrary and narrow definition of what it means to be part of the group. The problem with the no true Scotsman fallacy is that it undermines the possibility of meaningful debate. By adjusting the criteria for group membership to fit one's argument, it becomes impossible to disprove or even engage with the original claim. Instead of accepting that real-world examples might complicate the argument, the person using the fallacy tries to remove those complications by redefining the terms. This makes it difficult to have a productive conversation about the topic because the person is no longer willing to entertain any evidence that contradicts their viewpoint. This fallacy also contributes to a kind of exclusionary thinking. When people redefine groups in this way, they often do so to preserve a certain ideal or narrative that aligns with their worldview. It becomes less about understanding the complexity of human experiences or acknowledging differences and more about keeping the group pure or unblemished by opposing viewpoints or evidence. This is problematic because it fosters an environment where people are discouraged from challenging assumptions or expanding definitions, leading to more polarized and rigid thinking. In some cases, the no true Scotsman fallacy is used as a way to protect one's beliefs or ideals from criticism. For example, someone might argue that a particular country has always valued freedom and democracy. When someone points out instances where that country has acted in ways that contradict these values, the response might be, well, those actions don't count because they don't reflect the true spirit of the country. Instead of grappling with the contradiction, the speaker simply redefines what it means to be aligned with the country's ideals in order to exclude counterexamples. This kind of reasoning is unhelpful because it prevents a real exploration of what the country's values truly are and how they have been applied or misapplied over time. One of the reasons the no true Scotsman fallacy is so appealing is that it can feel like a valid defense. When someone challenges an ideal or belief that is important to us, it's tempting to dismiss the criticism by narrowing the definition of the group in question. This helps protect our sense of identity or the integrity of our worldview, but it does so at the cost of engaging with the complexities of reality. While it may offer a quick fix to an argument, it doesn't promote genuine understanding or allow for the possibility of change or growth in our thinking. To avoid falling into the trap of the no true Scotsman fallacy, it's important to be open to complexity and contradictions. Just because a counterexample challenges our view doesn't mean that the counterexample is irrelevant or that the group in question is no longer valid. Instead of redefining groups to fit our argument, we should be willing to acknowledge the diversity and variety within them. People within any group, whether it's a country, a religion, a political movement, or a culture, will have different views, actions, and behaviors, and those differences should be engaged with, not dismissed. When someone uses the no true Scotsman fallacy, it's useful to ask them to clarify their definition of the group or concept they are discussing. By making the criteria for membership more explicit, it becomes easier to engage with the argument and evaluate whether the definition is reasonable or whether it is being arbitrarily adjusted to protect the argument. In doing so, we can ensure that discussions remain grounded in facts and evidence, rather than being derailed by shifting definitions that prevent meaningful dialogue. The burden of proof reversal is a logical fallacy that occurs when someone makes a claim and expects others to disprove it, rather than providing evidence to support it themselves. In any reasonable discussion or debate, the person making the claim has the responsibility to provide proof. If they fail to do so, asking others to disprove the claim is a form of intellectual dishonesty. This fallacy shifts the responsibility of proving a claim onto the other party, which creates a situation where the conversation becomes more about defending against unfounded claims rather than addressing the actual topic. For example, imagine someone argues, "Aliens exist, and I have seen them." Instead of offering any concrete evidence for their claim, they might challenge the other person by saying, "Prove to me that aliens don't exist." This shifts the burden of proof onto the other person. The person making the claim about aliens should be the one responsible for providing evidence that supports their argument, not the person who is questioning it. By reversing the burden of proof, the claimant avoids having to justify their position. In a different scenario, suppose someone says, "I believe in the healing power of crystals. You can't prove they don't work." This is another case where the burden of proof is being reversed. Rather than providing evidence that crystals actually have healing properties, the person making the claim is asking others to prove that the crystals do not work. It is not up to others to disprove such claims, but to the person asserting them to provide convincing evidence that their belief is true. The burden of proof reversal can be seen in many types of arguments, including debates over science and religion. For instance, a person arguing in favor of creationism might say, "You can't prove that evolution is real, so my belief in creation is just as valid." Here, the person is asking others to disprove their claim about creationism instead of providing evidence for it. Evolution, supported by a large body of scientific evidence, is the prevailing explanation for the diversity of life on Earth, and creationism, as a religious belief, doesn't require scientific proof in the same way. But instead of justifying their belief, the person is trying to shift the burden to those who accept evolutionary theory. This tactic is often used when someone knows they cannot substantiate their claim with real evidence. Instead of acknowledging that their position may be weak or unsupported, they try to put others on the defensive. For example, if someone says, "I believe in ghosts," and then is met with skepticism, they might respond, "You can't prove that ghosts don't exist, so I'm right." This is an attempt to make the other person prove a negative, which is difficult and, in many cases, impossible. The person making the claim about ghosts is the one who should provide evidence that supports their belief, not the other way around. In some cases, the burden of proof reversal can be used strategically in debates or arguments. By putting the responsibility on others to disprove a claim, the person making the claim avoids the hard work of providing evidence. It shifts the conversation away from the legitimacy of the claim itself and forces the other person to defend against an unproven assertion. This tactic is often used in political debates or discussions about controversial issues, where a person may throw out sweeping, unsupported claims, expecting others to disprove them rather than proving them with sound evidence. One common tactic in political debates is when someone asserts, "This policy will save us money in the long run," without any supporting data. When questioned about how they reached that conclusion, they might say, "Well, you can't prove that it won't save us money." Here, they are attempting to reverse the burden of proof. Instead of explaining how they arrived at their conclusion or providing data, they are shifting the responsibility to the other person, making it difficult for the other side to disprove a vague claim that lacks any specific evidence. The problem with this fallacy is that it avoids addressing the actual argument or issue. Instead of offering compelling reasons or evidence, it focuses on putting the other person in a position where they are expected to prove a negative or engage in unnecessary defense. This is not a productive way of engaging in debate or conversation because it stalls the discussion and prevents real progress from being made. A good example of this is often seen in discussions about extraordinary claims. If someone asserts that a particular supernatural event occurred, such as a miracle, they might say, "You can't prove that it didn't happen." But, as with the alien example, it's not the responsibility of the skeptic to disprove the claim. The person making the claim should be the one providing the evidence. If someone claims to have witnessed a miracle, for instance, they should offer convincing evidence of it rather than challenging others to prove it didn't happen. In discussions about science, the burden of proof reversal can sometimes lead to a misunderstanding of how scientific knowledge works. If someone argues, "The theory of climate change is just a theory, and you can't prove it's happening," they are trying to reverse the burden of proof. The person making this claim is asking others to prove climate change doesn't exist, which is a reversal of the proper order. Scientific theories are supported by evidence, and it's not up to others to disprove them. It's up to the person making the claim to provide evidence that their theory is true. In the case of climate change, overwhelming evidence from a variety of scientific fields supports the conclusion that human activities are contributing to changes in the Earth's climate. Another example of burden of proof reversal is found in advertising. For instance, if a company claims that their product is the best on the market, but when asked for proof of its effectiveness, they respond, "Well, you can't prove that our product isn't the best." They are attempting to reverse the burden of proof. It is the responsibility of the company to provide evidence that their product is superior to others, not for consumers to disprove that claim. Without proper evidence or data to back up their assertions, this kind of argument becomes an attempt to sidestep accountability. The burden of proof reversal is also frequently used in legal settings, where a defendant might say, "You can't prove that I committed the crime, so I'm innocent." In this case, the defendant is trying to shift the burden of proving guilt to the prosecution, which is the opposite of how the legal system works. The prosecution is tasked with proving the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant does not have to prove their innocence, and the assertion that they are innocent cannot be considered valid until the prosecution fails to provide sufficient evidence to prove guilt. The fallacy also plays out in everyday personal arguments. If one person says, "You never help around the house," and the other person responds, "Well, you never clean the garage," the second person is attempting to reverse the burden of proof. Instead of addressing the original complaint about household chores, they shift the focus to something the first person is doing or not doing, trying to avoid responsibility. In all of these cases, the key issue is that the burden of proof rests on the person making a claim. If someone makes an assertion, they must provide evidence to support it. It is not the responsibility of others to disprove the claim, but to examine the evidence presented and evaluate the strength of the argument. Shifting the burden of proof is a way of sidestepping this responsibility, often leading to unproductive conversations where the focus shifts away from evaluating the actual claim and its merits. To avoid falling into the trap of the burden of proof reversal, it's important to remember that claims require evidence, not just the ability to deflect criticism or demand disproving. In any debate or discussion, it is essential to ask for evidence that supports the claims being made and to focus on the actual arguments, not on whether others can disprove them. By recognizing when the burden of proof is being improperly shifted, we can engage in more meaningful, evidence-based discussions. The hasty generalization fallacy occurs when someone draws a broad or sweeping conclusion based on a small or biased sample. This type of reasoning happens when people make assumptions about an entire group or situation without having enough evidence to support their claim. Essentially, it's when you take one or a few examples and apply them to a much larger context, even though the examples might not be representative or significant enough to make that kind of conclusion. For example, imagine someone meets two people from a particular city who are rude. Based on this limited experience, they might say, "People from that city are rude." This is a hasty generalization because the sample size is too small to make such a broad statement. Not all people from that city are likely to be rude just because two individuals were. The conclusion is based on an insufficient sample that doesn't reflect the broader reality. Another example might occur in the workplace. Suppose someone works with one person who is disorganized and lazy, and because of this, they conclude, "Everyone in this office must be disorganized and lazy." This is a clear, hasty generalization. They are basing their view of the entire office on just one person's behavior, which is not enough to draw a reliable conclusion about everyone else. The behavior of one individual does not represent the habits, attitudes, or work ethics of all other individuals in the office. Hasty generalizations can often occur when people make quick judgments about a group of people based on limited personal experiences or stereotypes. For instance, if someone has a bad experience with one customer service representative, they might think, "All customer service people are unhelpful." In this case, the person is generalizing the actions of one individual to an entire profession, which isn't a fair or reasonable assumption. The fact that one customer service representative wasn't helpful doesn't mean that all of them will be the same. This type of fallacy can also appear in discussions about social or cultural groups. Suppose someone meets a person from a particular country who is very outgoing and talkative. They might then think, "Everyone from that country is friendly and talkative." This is a hasty generalization because the behavior of one person doesn't speak for an entire country's population. Just because one individual behaves in a certain way doesn't mean everyone from that country will share the same traits or behaviors. There are many factors that influence how people act, such as upbringing, environment, and personal experiences. In politics, hasty generalizations can be used to unfairly characterize entire groups of people. For example, if someone meets a few people who identify with a particular political party and they seem arrogant or uninformed, they might say, "All people in that party are ignorant and arrogant." This is a hasty generalization because the speaker is taking the actions of a few individuals and applying them to the entire group. People in any political party are diverse, with different beliefs, opinions, and experiences. The actions of a small group of individuals do not represent everyone in the party. Hasty generalizations are also common when people rely on anecdotal evidence to make broad claims. For example, someone might say, "I tried a diet and I lost weight. Therefore, this diet is the best way to lose weight." While this may be true for the individual making the claim, it doesn't necessarily mean the diet will work for everyone. People have different body types, metabolisms, and health conditions, so one person's experience is not enough to conclude that the diet is universally effective. Without larger, more diverse evidence, making such a broad claim is a classic hasty generalization. Another common place where hasty generalizations arise is in product reviews or testimonials. Let's say a person reads a few bad reviews about a product and then decides, "This product must be terrible." They are basing their conclusion on a small number of reviews, which may not reflect the experiences of the majority of customers. Some negative reviews could be from people who had specific issues with the product, while many others might have had positive experiences. Basing an opinion on just a handful of reviews is a hasty generalization that doesn't give the full picture. The problem with hasty generalizations is that they lead to faulty conclusions, which can affect decision-making and perceptions. If we make decisions based on limited or biased information, we risk misunderstanding situations and making choices that aren't supported by the broader evidence. In the case of the person who decided that people from a city are rude because they met two rude individuals, they might avoid visiting the city or treating people from there unfairly, even though their judgment was based on a small and unrepresentative sample. The key issue with hasty generalizations is that they don't account for the diversity of experiences or characteristics within a group. People or situations are often far more complex than a single or small set of examples can reveal. For example, assuming that all customer service representatives are unhelpful based on a single bad experience overlooks the many representatives who go out of their way to assist customers. Similarly, assuming all people from a particular country share the same traits ignores the cultural, social, and individual differences that exist within any population. Hasty generalizations can also contribute to stereotypes, which are oversimplified and often inaccurate beliefs about a group of people. When someone generalizes the behavior of a few individuals to an entire group, they reinforce stereotypes, whether about nationality, race, gender, profession, or political affiliation. These stereotypes can perpetuate bias and prejudice, which can harm relationships, limit opportunities, and fuel division. By making assumptions based on incomplete or skewed information, we ignore the rich diversity and complexity of the world around us. To avoid making hasty generalizations, it's important to gather a larger and more representative sample of information before drawing conclusions. Instead of making judgments based on a small number of examples, we should seek out more data or experiences that can provide a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the issue. If we meet two rude people from a particular city, for instance, it's important to recognize that they are just two individuals, and we should not generalize their behavior to everyone from that city. Critical thinking involves questioning our assumptions and being open to a variety of perspectives. It's important to consider how representative our evidence is before forming conclusions. Just because something is true for one person or a few people doesn't mean it will be true for everyone. By recognizing and avoiding hasty generalizations, we can make more informed and fair judgments and avoid reinforcing misconceptions or biases. In some cases, it may also be helpful to seek out expert opinions or broader research on the issue at hand. If someone is making a claim about a specific diet or health practice, for example, it's important to look at scientific studies and a variety of expert opinions rather than relying on personal anecdotes or a small number of success stories. By broadening our sources of information, we can avoid drawing faulty conclusions and ensure that our decisions are based on well-rounded, reliable evidence. Ultimately, the hasty generalization fallacy serves as a reminder of how important it is to consider the full scope of a situation before making a judgment. It encourages us to seek out the broader context, to question assumptions, and to be cautious about drawing conclusions from incomplete or biased information. By doing so, we can make more thoughtful and accurate decisions that are grounded in reality, rather than in oversimplified or unfounded generalizations. The false equivalence fallacy occurs when two things that are fundamentally different are treated as if they are the same. This kind of reasoning fails to acknowledge important differences between the two things and instead makes them appear equal in value or significance. By ignoring these differences, false equivalence can mislead people into drawing incorrect conclusions, as it oversimplifies complex issues and masks the nuances that should be considered. One example of false equivalence can be found in debates about personal responsibility. Suppose someone argues, both smoking and eating junk food are bad for your health, so they should be treated the same. While both behaviors may indeed pose health risks, comparing them as if they have equal consequences is a false equivalence. Smoking has been definitively linked to serious diseases like lung cancer and heart disease, and the risks are well documented and immediate. Eating junk food, on the other hand, can contribute to health issues over time, but the direct link to fatal diseases is not as clear or immediate. By treating them as identical risks, the argument ignores important distinctions in their impact on health. In political debates, false equivalence can also be seen when people compare the actions or policies of two different parties or figures and claim they are equally problematic or harmful, even when the contexts or motivations differ significantly. For instance, someone might say, both political parties have been caught in scandals, so they're equally corrupt. This claim treats two situations as equivalent, even though the nature, scale, and consequences of the scandals could be vastly different. One scandal might involve illegal activities with serious consequences, while the other might be a minor mistake or a misunderstanding. By equating the two, the argument avoids looking at the specifics of each case and instead creates a false sense of moral parity. Another example of false equivalence can arise in discussions about climate change. Someone might argue, some people argue that climate change is caused by human activity, while others believe it's a natural cycle. Since both sides are equally valid, we should just ignore the scientific consensus. Here, the two positions are treated as equally legitimate, but in reality, the scientific consensus overwhelmingly supports the view that human activity is driving climate change. The belief in a natural cycle, while it may have been a part of the debate at one time, has been largely discredited by years of research and evidence. By presenting both sides as if they carry equal weight, the argument creates a false equivalence that obscures the scientific reality. False equivalence can also be used to downplay serious issues by equating them with something far less significant. For example, someone might say, criticizing a country's actions in a war is the same as being unpatriotic. This statement treats the act of criticizing a government or military decision as the same as rejecting one's country, even though the two things are not logically equivalent. Criticism of government actions can be an important part of democratic discourse, while rejecting one's country would imply disloyalty and a complete abandonment of national identity. The false equivalence here disregards the legitimate role of dissent in a healthy society and falsely equates it with a negative attitude toward the nation as a whole. The fallacy can also be found in moral arguments. For example, someone might argue, stealing a candy bar from a store is the same as embezzling millions from a company because both involve theft. While both actions are indeed theft, they are not morally or legally equivalent. Stealing a candy bar is a relatively minor crime with limited consequences, while embezzling millions involves a significant betrayal of trust, legal violations, and considerable harm to the company and its employees. Treating these two acts as the same is a false equivalence because it ignores the scale and impact of each action. In the world of media, false equivalence is often used to present two opposing viewpoints as if they are equally valid, even when one is supported by solid evidence and the other is not. For example, news outlets might cover a climate change debate by giving equal time to a scientist who supports the overwhelming evidence of human-caused climate change and to a so-called skeptic who denies the science, despite the fact that the skeptic's claims have been thoroughly debunked. By treating both perspectives as if they are equally credible, the media creates a false equivalence that misleads the public into thinking that the science behind climate change is still a subject of serious debate, when in reality, there is widespread consensus among scientists. False equivalence can also appear in social and cultural discussions. For example, someone might argue, both men and women can be equally violent in relationships, so we shouldn't focus on domestic violence against women. This oversimplifies the issue by equating two different problems that may have different underlying causes, contexts, and social consequences. While both men and women can be perpetrators of violence, domestic violence against women is a widespread issue that is often rooted in systemic gender inequality and power dynamics. Treating this issue as if it were equivalent to violence in general ignores the specific factors that make violence against women such a significant social problem. In personal arguments, false equivalence can occur when someone tries to compare two situations that are not comparable in any meaningful way. For instance, if two people are having an argument about the fairness of workplace promotions, one person might say, "But you got promoted last year, so why are you complaining about this promotion process?" This comparison treats the two situations as equivalent, even though the circumstances of each promotion could be very different. The person who got promoted last year might have had a different role, experience, or set of responsibilities than the person currently seeking promotion. By treating these situations as if they are the same, the argument fails to address the specific concerns of the person seeking the promotion. The danger of false equivalence is that it can lead people to ignore the nuances of a situation, simplifying it in a way that misrepresents the reality. It can be used to defend faulty arguments, mislead people, or create a false sense of balance where none exists. In many cases, false equivalence serves to avoid engaging with the complexities of an issue, instead pushing an oversimplified view that glosses over critical differences. To avoid falling into the trap of false equivalence, it's important to critically examine the differences between the two things being compared. Are the contexts, consequences, and specifics truly the same, or are there key differences that need to be acknowledged? Understanding the nuances of each side of an argument and recognizing when comparisons are unfair or misleading can help ensure that discussions are grounded in a more accurate and thoughtful understanding of the issue at hand. By doing so, we can avoid drawing faulty conclusions based on oversimplified or false equivalencies. The appeal to ignorance fallacy occurs when someone argues that a claim is true simply because it has not been proven false, or conversely, that a claim is false because it has not been proven true. This type of reasoning is flawed because just because something has not been disproven or proven doesn't mean it is true or false. The absence of evidence is not evidence itself, and making conclusions based on what is not known or cannot be proven creates a false sense of certainty. For example, imagine someone says, "No one has ever proven that aliens don't exist, so they must be real." This is a classic example of the appeal to ignorance. The fact that we have no definitive proof against the existence of aliens doesn't automatically mean that aliens exist. The inability to prove something false does not automatically validate it as true. Similarly, if someone claims, "No one has proven that ghosts exist, so they don't exist," this is another form of the appeal to ignorance. The lack of evidence for something does not automatically prove its non-existence. In both cases, the argument relies on the absence of evidence, rather than the evidence itself, to make a claim. This fallacy is especially common when discussing topics that are difficult to test or prove scientifically. When there is a lack of conclusive evidence, people might fill that gap with assumptions or beliefs that aren't based on reliable data. For example, in discussions about the supernatural, one person might argue, "There's no evidence that magic doesn't exist, so it must be real." This is an appeal to ignorance because it assumes that the absence of evidence is proof of existence. In reality, just because we haven't proven something does not automatically make it true. In fact, it may mean that there's simply not enough evidence to make a conclusion one way or the other. In legal settings, the appeal to ignorance can be seen when someone says, "There's no evidence proving that I committed this crime, so I must be innocent." While the absence of evidence might suggest doubt, it doesn't necessarily prove innocence. In a court of law, the burden of proof lies with the prosecution to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The absence of proof does not automatically lead to a conclusion of innocence, just as the absence of proof for a crime doesn't necessarily mean a person is guilty. This fallacy can undermine justice by misleading people into thinking that a lack of evidence automatically means that something is true or false. In everyday arguments, people can also use the appeal to ignorance to defend their beliefs. For instance, someone might say, "You can't prove that my preferred political candidate isn't the best choice, so they must be the best." Here, the speaker is relying on the absence of counterarguments or proof that their candidate is the best, rather than offering evidence that their candidate actually is the best. Just because no one has proven something false doesn't mean that it is true. In fact, it's more important to look at the available evidence and reasoning to determine whether a claim is valid, rather than relying on the absence of opposing evidence. Another example of the appeal to ignorance can be found in debates over controversial health claims. Suppose someone argues, "There's no scientific evidence proving that this herbal remedy doesn't work, so it must be effective." This argument is flawed because the lack of scientific evidence does not prove the remedy's effectiveness. It merely means that there is insufficient evidence to support the claim. The absence of evidence against something doesn't prove its validity. In fact, scientific claims require rigorous testing and evidence to establish their validity. Just because something has not been disproven doesn't mean it should be accepted as true without further investigation. In many discussions about religion, the appeal to ignorance is often used to defend belief in the existence of deities. For example, someone might argue, "You can't prove that God doesn't exist, so God must exist." This is an appeal to ignorance because it assumes that because something has not been disproven, it must be true. The lack of evidence against the existence of God does not automatically prove that God exists. Religious beliefs, like all beliefs, require thoughtful examination and evidence to support them, not simply the inability to disprove them. This fallacy is also common in debates over conspiracy theories. For example, someone might argue, "You can't prove that the moon landing was real, so it must have been faked." Here, the person is claiming that because no one can definitively disprove the moon landing, the opposite must be true. This reasoning is flawed because it ignores the overwhelming evidence supporting the reality of the moon landing, including photographs, videos, and the testimony of the astronauts involved. The inability of a person to disprove something does not automatically make it false or true. The moon landing is well documented, and the argument for its fakeness relies on the appeal to ignorance by dismissing this overwhelming evidence. The danger of the appeal to ignorance is that it shifts the burden of proof from the person making the claim to the person questioning it. This can lead to an unfair discussion where the person making the assertion doesn't have to provide evidence, but instead forces the other party to disprove it. For example, in debates about climate change, someone might argue, "You can't prove that human activity is the primary cause of climate change, so it must not be true." This argument wrongly assumes that the inability to prove a claim with absolute certainty means that the opposite is true. Climate change is supported by extensive scientific research and evidence, and just because some details may remain uncertain does not invalidate the overwhelming consensus among scientists. The appeal to ignorance is also prevalent in discussions about technology. For instance, someone might say, "There's no proof that artificial intelligence could ever become dangerous, so it's not a concern." This overlooks the fact that the lack of conclusive evidence does not mean that AI cannot become a threat in the future. It's important to base conclusions on the best available evidence, rather than dismissing concerns simply because they have not been definitively proven. Scientific fields like AI development involve ongoing research, and the absence of definitive proof today does not mean that dangers cannot emerge later. The appeal to ignorance is a logical fallacy that relies on the absence of evidence to support a claim, rather than providing positive proof or evidence for the claim itself. It's a way of asserting something as true simply because it hasn't been disproven. This fallacy can lead to faulty conclusions and prevent critical thinking by encouraging people to accept claims without proper evidence. To avoid falling into the trap of the appeal to ignorance, it's important to recognize that the lack of evidence for or against something is not proof of its truth or falsehood. Instead, we should seek out solid evidence, evaluate claims carefully, and be open to revising our beliefs based on new information and reliable sources. The special pleading fallacy occurs when someone applies a set of rules or standards to others but exempts themselves or their own position without providing a valid justification. Essentially, it's when someone makes an exception for themselves or their argument while holding everyone else to the same standard. This is a form of inconsistency because it suggests that there is a different set of rules for the person making the exception, even though no reasonable explanation is provided for why they should be exempt. An example of special pleading could occur in a discussion about responsibility. Imagine someone arguing that everyone should recycle to help protect the environment. However, When they are asked why they don't recycle, they respond, "Well, I don't have time for it and my individual actions won't make a difference." In this case, the person is holding others to the standard of recycling but exempting themselves from it without providing any valid reason. They are applying the rule to others while allowing themselves to bypass it based on their personal situation, without offering a sound justification. In political debates, special pleading can often be seen when politicians argue for certain rules or policies for others but refuse to follow them themselves. For instance, a politician might propose stricter laws on corporate tax evasion, stating that corporations should pay their fair share. However, when it comes to their own finances, they might use loopholes or offshore accounts to avoid taxes. When confronted with this, they might claim that it's different for them because they have a legal team that advises them, or that their situation is unique. By doing this, they are exempting themselves from the very rules they advocate for others to follow without offering a reasonable justification for why they deserve an exemption. Another example of special pleading might be seen in debates about personal freedoms. Suppose someone argues that individuals should be free to make their own choices in all aspects of life, including health decisions. But when it comes to a discussion about the COVID-19 vaccine, they might argue that it shouldn't be mandatory for people to get vaccinated. However, they might also claim that others should follow the rules of public health, suggesting that mandatory vaccination is an infringement on personal freedoms. Here, the person is applying the rule of personal freedom selectively, demanding that others comply with health mandates while exempting themselves from the same standard. In legal discussions, special pleading can arise when someone argues for a specific law or punishment for others but argues that they themselves should be treated differently. For example, a person might argue that people who break the law should be punished according to the severity of their crime. However, when faced with their own violation of the law, they might demand leniency, claiming that their case is different because of personal circumstances, or that their actions were not as severe as others' violations. This is a form of special pleading because they are asking to be treated differently without offering any justification for why they should be exempt from the punishment or standards they are advocating for others. In the realm of sports, special pleading can also be seen when athletes argue for stricter regulations or enforcement of rules but expect exceptions for themselves. For instance, an athlete might argue that athletes should undergo regular drug testing to ensure fairness and uphold integrity in sports. However, when they are caught using performance-enhancing drugs, they might claim that their case is different because they didn't know they were taking a banned substance, or because they believe their actions did not give them an unfair advantage. This argument exempts the athlete from the rule they were advocating for, which is an example of special pleading. Special pleading is often used in religious arguments as well. For example, someone might argue that their religion's teachings should be followed strictly, and that others should respect the laws and customs of their faith. However, when asked why they do not follow certain aspects of their religion, such as dietary restrictions or dress codes, they might respond by saying, "That rule doesn't apply to me because of my personal circumstances, or because it's just a cultural tradition, not a religious requirement." This is a case where the person is exempting themselves from the very rules they expect others to follow, without providing a valid reason why they should be treated differently. In discussions about moral behavior, special pleading can arise when people argue that certain moral principles should be universally followed, but they expect exceptions for their own actions. For example, someone might argue that it's wrong to lie, claiming that honesty is an essential part of a good character. However, when confronted with their own dishonesty, they might excuse it by saying, "It was a white lie, and I didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings." By doing this, they are applying the rule against lying to others but exempting themselves based on their personal situation, without justifying why their actions should be treated differently from others. Special pleading can also be seen in discussions about social norms or group behaviors. For example, someone might argue that people should adhere to social norms and treat others with respect, but when their own actions are questioned, they might say, "I didn't mean to disrespect anyone, and in my culture, it's perfectly fine to say those things." Here, the person is using their cultural background to excuse behavior that goes against the social norms they expect others to follow. This is another instance of special pleading, where the person is exempting themselves from the rules they expect others to follow, based on an arbitrary reason, such as their culture. In all of these examples, Special pleading is a way of using double standards to avoid being held accountable for one's own actions or beliefs. It is a fallacy because it lacks justification for the exemption. If someone is arguing for a rule, law, or standard to be applied universally, they must also apply it to themselves unless they can provide a reasonable justification for why they should be exempt. Without this, their argument becomes inconsistent, and their credibility may be undermined. To recognize and avoid special pleading, it's important to consistently apply the same standards to everyone, including ourselves. If we argue that rules should apply universally, we must be prepared to follow them ourselves and be accountable for our actions. If we expect others to follow certain behaviors or norms, we should not create exceptions for ourselves without offering valid reasons for why we deserve special treatment. Special pleading weakens arguments and prevents productive discussions, as it undermines the fairness and consistency that is necessary for resolving issues in a logical and reasonable way. Cherry-picking is a fallacy that happens when someone selectively chooses data or evidence that supports their argument while ignoring or dismissing evidence that contradicts it. This tactic distorts the truth because it gives a biased view of the issue, leaving out important context or opposing perspectives. It creates a misleading or incomplete picture of the situation by focusing only on the data that fits a particular narrative, while excluding anything that challenges it. An example of cherry-picking can be found in discussions about the effectiveness of a particular diet or exercise plan. Let's say someone is promoting a specific diet as the best way to lose weight. They might point to a few success stories of people who lost significant amounts of weight following this diet, ignoring the many others who didn't have the same success. By focusing on the positive outcomes and disregarding the failures, they are cherry-picking the data to create a misleading impression of the diet's effectiveness. This selective use of evidence leads others to believe that the diet is more successful than it actually is for the average person. Cherry-picking can also appear in scientific debates. For example, a person who denies the reality of climate change might look at a few years where the global temperature didn't increase as much as expected. They might say, "See, global temperatures haven't risen in the past few years, so the whole theory of climate change must be wrong." This is cherry-picking because they are ignoring the overwhelming body of evidence that shows long-term trends of warming. They are selecting short-term data that fits their argument while disregarding the larger, more comprehensive data that demonstrates the undeniable trend of global temperature increase. By doing this, they distort the truth and make the issue seem more uncertain than it really is. Another example can be seen in political debates, particularly when it comes to economic policy. Let's say a politician argues that a certain tax cut has been beneficial for the economy. They might highlight a specific year when the economy grew, while conveniently ignoring other years when the economy struggled or didn't grow as much, despite the same tax cuts. This selective use of data gives the impression that the tax cuts were universally successful, even though the broader picture might show mixed or even negative results. By cherry-picking the most favorable data, the politician avoids addressing the full range of outcomes, which could lead to a more balanced and honest evaluation of the policy. Cherry-picking also happens in discussions about social issues. For example, someone might argue that a certain country's crime rate has dropped dramatically because of a particular law they passed. They might point to a year where crime did decrease, while ignoring periods of time when crime rates actually went up, or when other factors unrelated to the law played a role. By focusing only on the data that supports their position, they create a false narrative about the effectiveness of the law, leaving out information that could provide a more complete understanding of the situation. In health discussions, cherry-picking is often used by those promoting alternative medicine. They might point to individual cases where a person felt better after using a particular supplement or treatment. However, they ignore or downplay the large number of people who did not experience any benefit or who even experienced negative side effects. By presenting only the success stories and ignoring the rest of the data, they create the illusion that their product or treatment is more effective than it really is. The problem with cherry-picking is that it leads people to make decisions or form opinions based on incomplete or distorted information. When important data is ignored, the overall picture becomes misleading. People may make choices or adopt beliefs that are based on a false understanding of the issue. For example, a person who is considering whether to use a certain health product might be swayed by success stories, but they may not realize that the product has not been proven to work in a large-scale study, or that the results were largely anecdotal. Cherry-picking also undermines the process of critical thinking. When we ignore opposing evidence, we are not engaging in a fair and thorough examination of the issue. Instead of considering all sides of an argument and evaluating the evidence in its entirety, we are only looking for the pieces that confirm what we already believe. This leads to biased reasoning and prevents us from fully understanding complex issues. It's easy to fall into the trap of cherry-picking when we are emotionally invested in a particular point of view, but doing so closes us off from other perspectives that could challenge our assumptions. In scientific research, cherry-picking can lead to false conclusions or biased findings. If researchers only report data that supports their hypothesis and ignore data that contradicts it, they can create an inaccurate portrayal of their findings. This kind of selective reporting can lead to a distorted understanding of the results, and may even lead to public mistrust of scientific findings. It's crucial for research to present all relevant data, including data that doesn't fit the hypothesis, so that a clear and accurate picture can be formed. Cherry-picking in research not only undermines the credibility of the study, but also harms the integrity of the scientific process. One of the dangers of cherry-picking is that it can perpetuate myths or misconceptions. When people only see one side of an issue, they may come to believe that side represents the whole truth. For example, in discussions about crime, someone might cherry-pick a few isolated incidents of violent crime in a particular area and use those to argue that the entire neighborhood is unsafe. This oversimplifies the situation, and people may come to believe that the area is much more dangerous than it actually is. Cherry-picking creates an incomplete understanding that can lead to irrational fears or misguided decisions. In everyday life, we are all susceptible to cherry-picking, especially when we are trying to justify our own opinions or actions. If we feel strongly about a particular position, we might be more inclined to look for information that supports it, while ignoring anything that contradicts our beliefs. This is natural, but it is important to recognize when we are engaging in cherry-picking so that we can be more objective and open-minded. A healthy approach to any issue involves considering all the relevant data and evaluating it fairly, rather than selectively choosing only the evidence that supports our argument. To avoid cherry-picking, it's important to practice critical thinking and strive for a balanced perspective. We should actively seek out a range of viewpoints and examine all available evidence before making decisions or forming opinions. By considering the full scope of information, we can make more informed choices and engage in more productive discussions. Cherry-picking, on the other hand, leads to an incomplete understanding of the issue and prevents us from seeing the bigger picture. It's essential to evaluate data holistically, acknowledging that any claim or argument should be backed up by all relevant evidence, not just the parts that support our viewpoint. The loaded question fallacy occurs when someone asks a question that contains a built-in assumption. This type of question is designed in such a way that no matter how the person answers, they seem to admit to something they may not actually agree with or have any evidence for. The question itself makes a presumption that is unfair or misleading, making it difficult to respond without feeling cornered or making a concession. A classic example of a loaded question is, "Have you stopped cheating on your tests?" This question assumes that the person has been cheating on their tests in the past, which may not be true. If the person answers yes, it implies that they had been cheating. If they answer no, it implies that they are still cheating. Either way, the person answering the question is stuck in a position where their response appears to confirm the assumption in the question. This type of question is manipulative because it forces the person to address an accusation without giving them a chance to deny the underlying assumption. Loaded questions are often used in debates or arguments to put someone in a difficult position. For instance, in a political debate, someone might ask, "Why do you support this policy that harms the economy?" This question assumes that the policy does harm the economy, which may be up for debate. The person answering the question is forced to either defend the assumption that the policy harms the economy or reject it, which may require them to get into a complex argument about the economic effects of the policy. In either case, the question is structured to lead the conversation in a direction that is advantageous to the person asking it, rather than allowing for an open, balanced discussion. Another example can be seen in a personal relationship. Suppose one person asks, "Why are you being so difficult about this?" This question assumes that the other person is being difficult, which may not be the case at all. The person being asked the question is put on the defensive and forced to either explain why they are not being difficult, thus accepting the label of being difficult, or give a reason for their actions that still validates the assumption. The question doesn't allow for a neutral or objective discussion about the issue at hand. Instead, it forces the person to deal with a presumption that they may not agree with. In a courtroom, a prosecutor might ask a defendant, "When did you stop lying to the police?" This question assumes that the defendant has been lying to the police at some point, which could lead to an unfair portrayal of the defendant's actions. The defendant is put in a position where they must answer in a way that acknowledges the assumed behavior, even though they may not have been lying at all. This type of questioning is meant to make the defendant look guilty or dishonest, even without offering direct evidence of wrongdoing. The use of loaded questions is common in advertising as well. For example, a car commercial might ask, "How can you drive anything but the safest car on the road?" This question assumes that the car being advertised is the safest, which may not be the case. It puts pressure on the viewer to accept that the car is the safest, or else they are left wondering why they wouldn't want the safest option. The question doesn't invite critical thinking or an examination of the facts. It assumes a conclusion that may not be accurate. In debates about social issues, loaded questions can also be used to make someone appear unreasonable or out of touch. For example, someone might ask, "Why do you want to deny people their basic rights?" This question assumes that the person in question is actively trying to deny others' rights, which may not be true. The person being asked the question is forced to either explain why they are not trying to deny rights, which would still imply that the person asking the question is correct, or to argue against the loaded assumption. Either way, the person is put in a difficult position. Loaded questions are manipulative because they don't allow for a fair or open response. The person being asked the question is not given the opportunity to address the underlying assumption or to present their own perspective without being unfairly boxed into a corner. This type of questioning can be used to discredit someone, create doubt in others' minds, or shift the focus of the conversation away from the real issues. It's a tactic that undermines honest discussion and can distort the flow of a conversation or debate. To avoid falling victim to loaded questions, it's important to recognize when one is being asked a question that contains an unfair assumption. In such cases, it's often helpful to call attention to the loaded nature of the question before answering. For example, if someone asks, "Why do you refuse to acknowledge the harm this policy causes?" A good response might be, "I don't agree that this policy causes harm, and I think we need to examine the evidence more carefully." By pointing out that the question assumes something that is still up for debate, the person being asked can steer the conversation back to a more neutral and fair ground. Another way to deal with loaded questions is to reframe them. For instance, if someone asks, "Why did you lie to your boss?" a person might respond, "I didn't lie to my boss. Let's talk about the issue we're really facing here." This redirects the conversation away from the unfair assumption in the question and refocuses on the actual matter at hand. By doing so, the person avoids getting bogged down in defending an accusation that may not even be accurate, and instead brings the discussion back to the facts. When answering loaded questions, it's also important to remain calm and avoid getting defensive. Often, loaded questions are designed to provoke an emotional response or to pressure someone into agreeing with a false assumption. By staying composed and addressing the underlying issue directly, it becomes easier to avoid being manipulated into accepting the unfair presumption embedded in the question. In discussions about complex issues, loaded questions can derail productive conversation and lead to misunderstandings. They can prevent the exploration of real solutions by focusing on false assumptions or deflecting attention away from the actual points of debate. When engaging in discussions or debates, it's crucial to be mindful of the questions being asked and to challenge any that seem to contain unfair assumptions. By doing so, conversations can stay focused on the facts and lead to more honest, thoughtful discussions. Recognizing and addressing loaded questions is essential to having a fair conversation. Whether in personal, political, legal, or social contexts, loaded questions can shape the outcome of a discussion by manipulating the terms of the debate. By questioning the assumptions behind the question, people can ensure that their position is accurately represented and that the conversation remains focused on what truly matters. The middle ground fallacy occurs when someone assumes that the truth must lie somewhere between two extremes, simply because it seems like a fair compromise. This kind of reasoning suggests that if two sides of an argument disagree, the best solution is always a middle ground between their positions. However, this is a flawed way of thinking because the truth or the best solution isn't necessarily halfway between two opposing views. Sometimes one side may be completely right and the other may be completely wrong. The idea that the truth is always somewhere in the middle overlooks the possibility that one position might be fully supported by evidence, while the other is based on misconceptions or false information. For example, imagine two people arguing about climate change. One person insists that human activity is causing significant changes in the climate, while the other denies that human activity has any effect on the climate. A third person might suggest, well, the truth must lie somewhere in between. Maybe human activity is causing a little bit of climate change, but not as much as the first person thinks. This is a middle ground fallacy because it assumes that the truth is always found between the two extremes, even though the overwhelming scientific consensus supports the first person's position. The fact that there is a clear and strong body of evidence pointing to human impact on the climate means that a compromise is not necessary or justified. The middle ground approach here simply ignores the weight of the evidence on one side. This fallacy can also be seen in political debates. For instance, one side might argue for stricter environmental regulations to reduce pollution, while the other side argues for less government interference and fewer regulations. A middle ground fallacy might lead someone to conclude that the solution is to have some regulations, but not too many, thinking that this is the best compromise. However, the reality is that the solution to the problem might not be found by simply meeting in the middle. It could be that stricter regulations are necessary to adequately address environmental concerns, and any compromise that weakens the regulations would only harm efforts to tackle the issue effectively. In such cases, the middle ground does not always represent the best solution. In everyday life, people often assume that the best answer is the one that splits the difference between two extremes. For example, suppose two friends are arguing about how much time they should spend at a party. One wants to stay until midnight, while the other wants to leave at 9 p.m. The compromise might seem like a good idea. They'll stay until 10:30 p.m. and call it a night. This might seem fair on the surface, but the real solution could depend on other factors, like the reason for the differing preferences. Maybe one person has to get up early the next morning, and the other just enjoys staying out late. The middle ground might seem like a reasonable compromise, but it could ignore the true needs or desires of each person. Sometimes the best solution is not a compromise at all, but rather a more thoughtful consideration of the individual needs of each party. In the context of education, the middle ground fallacy can also manifest in debates about how to approach teaching. Imagine two educators debating whether a particular subject should be taught in depth or only covered briefly. One argues for a comprehensive, detailed approach, while the other believes the subject should only be touched upon briefly to avoid overwhelming students. Someone might suggest a middle ground, saying that the subject should be taught at a moderate level of detail. However, this doesn't necessarily mean it's the best choice. If the subject is complex and requires a deeper understanding, the best solution might be to teach it thoroughly, even if it's more difficult for students to grasp. In this case, the middle ground may undermine the goal of providing a meaningful and comprehensive education. The middle ground fallacy often arises in discussions about controversial topics. For example, if someone argues that abortion should always be legal, and another person argues that it should never be legal, a third person might suggest that the middle ground is to make abortion legal only in certain cases, such as when the woman's health is at risk. While this might seem like a reasonable compromise, it doesn't address the actual moral or legal arguments in a meaningful way. The best solution might not be a compromise, but rather a more nuanced understanding of the underlying issues, such as individual rights, bodily autonomy, and the responsibilities of society. Assuming that the middle ground is the right answer without critically evaluating the underlying arguments is a flawed approach. The middle ground fallacy is also evident in historical debates. For instance, in discussions about the outcomes of past wars, some people might argue that one side was completely justified in their actions, while others might argue that both sides were equally to blame. The middle ground fallacy would suggest that the truth lies somewhere in between, and both sides share equal responsibility for the war. However, the reality might be more complicated. One side may have been much more aggressive or unjustified in their actions, and assuming that the truth lies in the middle could oversimplify the historical context and the events that led to the conflict. Sometimes, the middle ground fallacy emerges in conversations about public health. Let's say one group of people advocates for mandatory vaccination for everyone to prevent the spread of disease, while another group opposes mandatory vaccination altogether, arguing that it infringes on personal freedom. A middle ground solution might suggest that vaccination should be voluntary but incentivized through rewards or discounts. While this might seem like a fair compromise, it may not address the urgency or importance of public health in certain situations. If the risk of disease transmission is high, the best solution may not be found by meeting in the middle, but by ensuring widespread vaccination, even if it requires mandates. The middle ground might ultimately undermine the effectiveness of the public health response. In legal contexts, the middle ground fallacy can appear when people suggest compromises that don't align with the law. For example, in a case involving a defendant who has been convicted of a serious crime, someone might suggest a compromise sentence, such as a reduced sentence, in the belief that this will be fair to both the defendant and the victim. However, this middle ground approach might ignore the seriousness of the crime and the need for justice. The law may call for a certain penalty based on the crime's severity, and a compromise could result in a sentence that does not adequately reflect the gravity of the offense. The middle ground fallacy can also be seen in debates over moral issues. Suppose two people are discussing the ethics of animal testing. One person argues that animal testing should never be allowed under any circumstances, while the other argues that it should be allowed whenever it's necessary for scientific progress. Someone might suggest that the compromise is to allow animal testing only in certain cases where it is deemed absolutely necessary. While this might seem like a reasonable middle ground, it may not address the core ethical concerns about the treatment of animals. The best solution might require a deeper examination of alternatives to animal testing and whether any testing is truly justified, rather than simply finding a middle ground between two opposing views. The middle ground fallacy is appealing because it often seems like a fair and balanced approach. It's easy to assume that if two sides disagree, the solution must be somewhere in between. However, this approach ignores the possibility that one side may be based on a more solid foundation of evidence, ethics, or logic. The truth is not always found in the middle, and sometimes the best solution requires rejecting the middle ground in favor of a more nuanced or extreme position. By assuming that the compromise is always the right answer, we risk oversimplifying complex issues and failing to address the underlying factors that shape the debate. Critical thinking and careful consideration of all perspectives are essential in finding the best solution, rather than simply splitting the difference. Gaslighting is a manipulative tactic where one person makes another doubt their own perceptions, memory, or logic. It's a form of emotional abuse that works by causing confusion and self-doubt, often with the goal of gaining control over the other person or making them feel powerless. The term comes from a play and later a film titled Gaslight, in which a husband manipulates his wife into thinking she is losing her mind by subtly changing aspects of their environment, such as dimming the gas lights and then denying that anything has changed. Over time, she begins to question her sanity. For example, imagine a person notices that their partner has been acting distant. When they bring it up, the partner responds by saying, "You're just being paranoid. I've been fine, you're overthinking things." The person starts to second-guess their own feelings and perceptions, wondering if they are indeed just imagining the situation. The partner continues to insist that nothing is wrong, making the other person doubt their own observations. Over time, the person may begin to feel confused and unsure of themselves, questioning whether their instincts are accurate. This is a classic example of gaslighting, where the manipulator distorts the reality of the situation to make the other person question their own experiences. In a workplace setting, gaslighting can happen when a boss consistently dismisses an employee's concerns or questions their work performance, even when the employee is meeting expectations. For instance, if an employee submits a report and the boss says, "I'm not sure you understand the project, you're not making any sense." Even though the report is clear and well-researched, the employee may start to doubt their abilities. The boss might continue with comments like, "I don't know how you could think that was good work," or "You're misinterpreting what I asked for," even if no real mistakes were made. The goal is not to correct the work, but to make the employee feel uncertain about their skills or judgment. Over time, the employee might feel unable to trust their own work or even their own perception of events. In relationships, gaslighting can be especially damaging because it often involves deep emotional manipulation. A person may deny things they've said or done to make their partner question their memory or feelings. For example, one partner might say, "I never said that. You're making it up." Even though the other partner clearly remembers the conversation, the manipulator's repeated denials can lead them to doubt themselves. They may start to think, "Did I really hear that? Maybe I am remembering it wrong." The manipulator might continue with comments like, "You're just too sensitive," or "You're being too emotional," further eroding the victim's confidence in their own perceptions and feelings. Gaslighting in this context can make the victim feel isolated, confused, and unsure about what is real, making them more dependent on the manipulator. Gaslighting doesn't just involve denying things that happened or comments that were made. It can also involve changing the narrative of a situation or making the victim feel that they are the cause of problems that aren't their fault. For instance, if someone is constantly late to meetings and the other person points it out, the gaslighter might respond, "You always make such a big deal out of everything. It's not like I'm the only one who's ever late. Why are you always picking on me?" This shifts the focus from the gaslighter's behavior to the victim's reaction, making the victim feel responsible for the problem. The victim might start to feel that their concerns are unreasonable, even though they are just asking for respect and punctuality. Over time, this tactic can lead the victim to feel as though they are always in the wrong or that their perceptions are distorted. In friendships, gaslighting can also be a way for one person to gain control or avoid taking responsibility. Imagine a situation where one friend regularly cancels plans or shows up late. When the other friend expresses frustration, the gaslighter might say, "I don't know why you're upset. You're always so dramatic. I've had a lot going on." Instead of acknowledging the behavior that hurt the other person, the gaslighter deflects by making the victim feel like they are being unreasonable or overly sensitive. The victim might begin to feel guilty for being upset, even though they have every right to be frustrated by their friend's behavior. Over time, this can cause them to doubt their own feelings and feel guilty for expressing their needs. One of the most insidious aspects of gaslighting is that it often occurs gradually. The manipulator doesn't suddenly start trying to control or confuse the other person. Instead, they do so subtly over time, making small, dismissive comments or actions that add up. A person being gaslighted may not even realize that they're being manipulated at first. They may dismiss their feelings or memories, thinking they are overreacting or imagining things. But as the manipulator continues to chip away at their sense of self-trust, the victim becomes more uncertain about what is real and less confident in their ability to navigate the world around them. In more extreme cases, gaslighting can lead to severe emotional or psychological harm. Victims may start to lose confidence in themselves and their abilities, feeling confused, anxious, or even depressed. They might feel that they can never get anything right or that their thoughts and feelings are always wrong. Over time, this can erode their self-esteem and make it harder for them to trust themselves or their judgment. In relationships where gaslighting is prevalent, it can create an unhealthy dynamic where the victim feels trapped and dependent on the manipulator. They may feel as though they are always at fault or that they can never escape the cycle of manipulation. Gaslighting can be difficult to recognize because it often involves a combination of tactics, including denial, deflection, and blame shifting. The manipulator may seem sincere or even apologetic at times, making the victim question whether they are overreacting. The victim may find themselves constantly apologizing, even when they have done nothing wrong, simply to avoid further conflict or accusations. Gaslighting can make the victim feel like they are losing control of their own thoughts and feelings, leading them to doubt their own sanity. To protect oneself from gaslighting, it is important to be aware of the signs and recognize when someone is manipulating your perception of reality. If someone repeatedly denies things they have said or done, or makes you feel as though your feelings are not valid, this could be a sign of gaslighting. Keeping track of events, conversations, and feelings can help you maintain clarity and avoid being manipulated. If you find yourself questioning your own memory or perception, it might be helpful to talk to a trusted friend or family member who can offer an outside perspective. Gaslighting thrives in isolation, So reaching out for support can help you regain your confidence and sense of reality. Ultimately, gaslighting is a tactic that seeks to undermine the victim's confidence and make them question their own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. It is a form of emotional abuse that can leave lasting damage, but recognizing it early can help prevent further harm. Being aware of manipulative behaviors and taking steps to protect your mental and emotional health is key to resisting gaslighting and maintaining a strong sense of self. The false analogy fallacy occurs when someone makes a comparison between two things that seem similar on the surface but are actually not comparable in meaningful ways. This type of reasoning is flawed because it draws conclusions based on superficial similarities, without considering the key differences that make the comparison invalid. When using a false analogy, the person making the argument assumes that because two things share one or two traits, they must be alike in all respects, which leads to misleading conclusions. For example, consider an argument that says, allowing people to smoke marijuana is just like allowing people to drink alcohol. Both are substances that can impair judgment, so they should be treated the same. While there is a superficial similarity between alcohol and marijuana in that both can have intoxicating effects, the comparison overlooks important differences between them, such as their legal status, their varying effects on the body and brain, or the different levels of social acceptance and health risks associated with each. The two substances are not truly comparable in every respect, and so the analogy fails to account for the broader context, making it an example of a false analogy. Another example could be found in political debates. Suppose a politician argues, running a government is just like running a business. If a business can make profits by cutting unnecessary expenses, the government should be able to do the same to balance the budget. On the surface, this might seem like a reasonable comparison. After all, businesses and governments both handle money and resources. However, the analogy ignores important differences between the two. A business's primary goal is to maximize profit, while a government's goal is to serve the public good, which includes providing public services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. The needs of a government are much more complex and far-reaching than those of a business. A business can focus on trimming costs to increase profits, but the government's decisions often involve balancing competing needs and priorities that cannot simply be reduced to budget cuts. The comparison oversimplifies the complexities of government and fails to account for the broader scope of its functions, making it a false analogy. In discussions about education, someone might say, learning to read is just like learning to ride a bike. Once you learn, you never forget. While it might be tempting to compare these two skills because they both involve learning something that is useful throughout life, the comparison overlooks key differences in how we learn and retain these skills. Reading involves continuous practice and development, especially as we encounter more complex texts, while riding a bike is more of a one-time learning experience that doesn't require ongoing refinement once you've mastered it. This analogy falsely assumes that both skills operate in exactly the same way, leading to a misleading conclusion about the nature of learning and retention. A common example of false analogy can be found in the context of environmental debates. One person might argue, taking care of the environment is just like taking care of your personal health. You wouldn't put unhealthy food into your body, so we shouldn't pollute the environment. While there are similarities between caring for the environment and taking care of one's body, the analogy oversimplifies the issue. The environment is far more complex than a human body, and the consequences of environmental harm are not as immediate or visible as the personal health effects of eating unhealthy food. Additionally, actions like pollution involve larger systems, economies, and long-term effects that go beyond individual responsibility, unlike personal health, which can often be managed on an individual level. Comparing the two in this way glosses over these important differences and leads to an overly simplistic view of environmental responsibility. In legal discussions, a person might argue, treating this case like any other assault case is just like treating a car accident as if it were the same as a motorcycle accident. Both involve collisions, so they must be the same. This analogy ignores significant differences between assault cases and the specific factors that might influence the outcome of a particular case, such as intent, the nature of the harm, or the context in which the incident occurred. Similarly, comparing car and motorcycle accidents overlooks important differences in how they occur, their severity, and the potential injuries involved. Just because two things share one basic feature, like a collision, doesn't mean they can be treated as identical in all respects. The false analogy fallacy also appears in debates about social issues. Suppose someone argues, if we can have a free market for goods and services, we should also have a free market for healthcare. After all, if people can buy and sell food without interference, they should be able to buy and sell healthcare the same way. This argument assumes that healthcare and food are comparable in all respects, but they are not. Food is a basic need, and while the market for food can generally meet demand through competition and choice, healthcare involves more complex issues, such as the need for equitable access to medical care, the potential for life or death consequences, and the complex role of insurance, regulations, and government intervention. The analogy fails to account for these differences, making it a false analogy. False analogies can also arise in debates about moral or ethical questions. For example, someone might argue, if we allow same-sex couples to marry, then we should also allow people to marry their pets, because marriage is just about love and commitment. This comparison wrongly assumes that the relationship between a person and their pet is similar to that between two consenting adults, ignoring fundamental differences between these types of relationships. The analogy fails to consider the unique aspects of human relationships, such as mutual consent, personal autonomy, and legal rights that are integral to the idea of marriage. It oversimplifies the issue and leads to a misleading conclusion. In everyday situations, false analogies can sometimes be used to justify personal behavior. For example, someone might say, eating fast food every day is just like eating a home-cooked meal. They both provide the same basic nutrients, so it's not that big of a deal. This comparison overlooks the fact that the nutritional value, long-term health impacts, and quality of ingredients in fast food versus home-cooked meals can be drastically different. While both meals may provide calories, they do not offer the same balance of nutrients, nor do they have the same impact on one's health over time. The analogy fails to account for the larger differences in quality and impact, leading to an oversimplified and misleading view of nutrition. False analogies are often persuasive because they rely on the simplicity of comparing two things that seem similar at first glance. However, they fail to take into account the complexities and key differences that make the comparison invalid. To avoid falling into the trap of false analogy, it's important to carefully consider whether the things being compared are truly alike in relevant and meaningful ways. Just because two things share one or two characteristics doesn't mean they are comparable in every respect. In order to make valid arguments, it's crucial to identify the relevant differences and complexities that might make one thing more suitable for comparison than another. Overgeneralization is a fallacy that happens when someone applies a general rule or conclusion too broadly, without enough evidence to support it. This type of reasoning makes sweeping statements about a group, situation, or trend based on limited information. By drawing conclusions from just a few examples or experiences, overgeneralization ignores the complexities or exceptions that might exist, leading to inaccurate or misleading conclusions. For example, imagine someone meets a few people from a particular city and has a negative experience with them. They might then say, "People from that city are rude." This is an overgeneralization because it takes the behavior of a small number of individuals and applies it to everyone from that city, which isn't fair or accurate. Just because a few people were rude doesn't mean everyone from that city shares the same characteristic. The generalization ignores the diversity of individuals in the city and reduces them to one narrow stereotype based on a limited sample size. In another example, consider someone who has a bad experience with one dog breed, such as a pit bull. They might then say, "All pit bulls are aggressive and dangerous." This is an overgeneralization because it takes one bad experience or a few isolated incidents and applies them to an entire breed. The behavior of one or two dogs doesn't represent the breed as a whole. In fact, pit bulls, like any other breed, can vary greatly in temperament depending on their upbringing, training, and environment. By overgeneralizing, the person disregards the many pit bulls that are friendly and well-behaved, and they form an unfair opinion of the entire breed based on limited encounters. Overgeneralization can also occur in the context of social issues. For instance, if someone argues, "All politicians are corrupt," they are making an overgeneralization. While corruption may be present among some politicians, it is not accurate to say that all politicians are corrupt. This statement fails to account for the many politicians who work honestly and diligently for the benefit of their constituents. By applying the general rule to all politicians, the person disregards the complexities of the political landscape and paints everyone with the same brush, even though the reality is more nuanced. In discussions about education, overgeneralization might come into play when someone says, "All students today are lazy and uninterested in learning." This is an overgeneralization because it assumes that every student fits the same mold, even though students have diverse interests, abilities, and work ethics. There may be some students who struggle with motivation, but there are many others who are passionate, hardworking, and committed to their education. The statement ignores the variety of experiences and challenges that students face, and it simplifies the situation by attributing the same negative trait to everyone. Overgeneralization is also common when people discuss entire generations. A person might say, "Millennials don't care about hard work. They want everything handed to them." This statement overgeneralizes the behavior of a whole generation based on limited observations or stereotypes. While some millennials may prioritize work-life balance or value different kinds of success, many others work just as hard as previous generations. Overgeneralizing like this ignores the diverse perspectives and experiences within any generation, reducing them to a single trait that may not apply to everyone. In the realm of health and fitness, overgeneralization can happen when someone says, "All diets are unhealthy and they never work." This is an overgeneralization because it dismisses the many different kinds of diets available and ignores the fact that some diets are based on sound nutritional principles. While some popular diets may not be effective or sustainable, others may be tailored to individual needs and may provide long-term health benefits. By labeling all diets as bad, the person overlooks the potential for well-balanced, scientifically supported diet plans that could work for many people. Overgeneralization is also common in discussions about mental health. For example, someone might say, "People with depression are just lazy and don't want to get better." This statement is an overgeneralization because it oversimplifies a complex mental health condition. Depression is a serious illness that affects people in different ways, and it often involves a combination of genetic, psychological, and environmental factors. To say that people with depression are lazy dismisses the challenges they face and fails to recognize the importance of treatment, therapy, and support in managing the condition. The person making the overgeneralization ignores the wide range of experiences and struggles that individuals with depression endure, reducing them to a single, unfair stereotype. Overgeneralization can also show up in arguments about personal preferences or lifestyle choices. For example, someone might argue, "People who choose to live in cities are just materialistic and selfish." This is an overgeneralization because it assumes that all people who live in cities share the same values, such as materialism or selfishness. People choose to live in cities for many reasons, such as career opportunities, cultural experiences, or access to public services. By assuming that all city dwellers are materialistic, the person makes a broad and unfair judgment based on their own biases or limited experience. Another example of overgeneralization can be seen in discussions about race or ethnicity. Suppose someone says, "People from that country are all dishonest and lazy." This is a harmful overgeneralization because it attributes negative traits to an entire group of people based on their nationality. It ignores the fact that individuals from that country, like people from any other, are diverse in terms of their work ethic, values, and character. This type of thinking fuels prejudice and stereotypes and creates unfair expectations about an entire group of people. The problem with overgeneralization is that it leads to misunderstandings and misjudgments. By assuming that one characteristic or behavior applies to an entire group or situation, we fail to see the complexities and variations within that group or situation. This kind of thinking reduces people to simple stereotypes and prevents us from understanding their full humanity or the nuances of a given issue. When we overgeneralize, we miss out on the opportunity to see the whole picture and make more informed, fair decisions. Overgeneralization also shuts down meaningful conversations by creating a false narrative that ignores alternative perspectives. For example, if someone says, "All technology is bad for society," they are ignoring the countless ways in which technology has improved people's lives, from advances in medicine to improvements in communication. This broad statement doesn't allow for a nuanced discussion of the potential benefits and challenges of technology. By overgeneralizing, we miss the chance to explore the issue in depth and to find solutions to the problems that technology may cause, while still appreciating the benefits it brings. To avoid overgeneralization, it's important to be aware of the tendency to make broad statements based on limited information. Instead of jumping to conclusions based on a few examples or isolated experiences, it's helpful to look at the bigger picture and recognize the diversity and complexity of any issue. By considering the full range of evidence and perspectives, we can form more accurate and fair conclusions and avoid the traps of stereotyping and oversimplification. Ultimately, overgeneralization is a shortcut to thinking that doesn't take into account the full range of information. It may make arguments easier to defend, but it doesn't lead to the most accurate or fair understanding of an issue. By challenging our own tendency to overgeneralize, we can engage more thoughtfully with the world around us and make better, more informed decisions. The argument from incredulity fallacy occurs when someone dismisses a claim simply because they find it hard to believe or understand. This type of reasoning assumes that if something seems unbelievable or beyond one's comprehension, it must be false. However, just because something is difficult to grasp or seems extraordinary doesn't mean it isn't true. The argument from incredulity relies on the person's limited perspective or understanding rather than examining the actual evidence or reasoning behind a claim. For example, imagine a person argues, "I can't believe that humans have landed on the moon. It's just too incredible for me to accept, so it must be a hoax." In this case, the person is rejecting the reality of the moon landing not because of evidence to the contrary, but simply because the idea seems too difficult or unbelievable for them to accept. The argument from incredulity doesn't engage with the actual evidence of the moon landing, such as photographs, videos, and the testimony of astronauts, engineers, and scientists. Instead, it relies on personal disbelief as the basis for dismissal. Another example can be found in the realm of science, where someone might say, "I just can't believe that climate change is happening because of human activity. It sounds too complicated and too drastic. It just doesn't make sense to me." This is an argument from incredulity because the person is rejecting the overwhelming body of scientific evidence supporting human-caused climate change, simply because the issue is complex and hard to comprehend. The argument doesn't consider the extensive data, studies, and expert consensus on the topic, but instead relies on the speaker's inability to fully grasp the science as a reason to dismiss it. The argument from incredulity often comes up in debates about new technologies or scientific advancements. For instance, when discussing artificial intelligence, one person might argue, "I don't believe that AI could ever think or learn like a human. It seems impossible." Here, the person is using their lack of understanding of AI technology to dismiss the possibility of AI development. The fact that AI is complex and not fully understood by everyone doesn't negate the evidence and progress in the field. Dismissing the possibility of AI reaching advanced levels of learning based on one's personal incredulity ignores the research and breakthroughs in the field of machine learning and neural networks. In discussions about medicine or health, an argument from incredulity might arise when someone hears about a rare disease or an unconventional treatment. For example, if someone is told about a rare medical condition they've never heard of, they might say, "That doesn't sound possible. I've never heard of it, so it can't be real." This statement dismisses the possibility of the condition simply because it's unfamiliar to the person making the claim. The fact that a condition is rare or not widely known doesn't make it untrue. Medicine is full of diseases and conditions that are not widely understood or that only affect a small number of people, but that doesn't make them any less real. The argument from incredulity here ignores the medical knowledge and research that supports the condition's existence. In everyday life, people might use the argument from incredulity when faced with new ideas or unfamiliar concepts. For example, someone might argue, "I don't believe in mindfulness meditation. It just sounds too simple to make a real difference." Here, the person is dismissing the practice of mindfulness simply because they can't believe it could have a meaningful impact on mental health. However, research has shown that mindfulness and other forms of meditation can have significant benefits, such as reducing stress, improving focus, and enhancing emotional well-being. Just because someone cannot imagine how such a simple practice could have real benefits does not mean it's not effective. The argument from incredulity dismisses the actual evidence in favor of personal disbelief. The argument from incredulity is often seen in political or social debates as well. For example, when discussing the possibility of achieving universal healthcare, someone might say, "I don't believe it's possible to provide healthcare for everyone. It just doesn't make sense." This argument assumes that because the solution seems complex or difficult to achieve, it must be impossible. However, many countries around the world have successfully implemented universal healthcare systems, and there are plenty of studies and models to support the feasibility of such systems. By relying on personal disbelief, the argument overlooks the successful examples and evidence that show universal healthcare is not only possible but effective. In discussions about social or cultural issues, the argument from incredulity can be used to dismiss the experiences or struggles of others. For instance, if someone argues, "I don't think racism is really a problem in this country anymore. It doesn't make sense to me that it's still such a big issue," they are using their inability to understand or experience racism as a reason to dismiss its existence. This argument ignores the evidence of systemic racism and the lived experiences of those who face discrimination. The fact that the person making the argument hasn't personally experienced racism doesn't mean that it is not a real and pressing issue for others. The argument from incredulity here denies the validity of the experiences of marginalized groups based on the person's limited understanding or perspective. The danger of the argument from incredulity is that it prevents people from engaging with new or complex ideas. By relying on personal disbelief, this fallacy discourages open-mindedness and critical thinking. Just because something seems unbelievable or difficult to understand doesn't mean it isn't true or possible. Science, technology, and human progress often involve breakthroughs that were once thought impossible. The argument from incredulity closes the door on the possibility of discovery or change by dismissing ideas based on limited understanding or personal biases. To avoid falling into the trap of the argument from incredulity, it is important to approach new information with an open mind and a willingness to learn. Instead of dismissing something because it seems difficult to believe, we should consider the evidence and reasoning behind it. If something seems unbelievable, it's worth investigating further and asking questions to better understand it. Challenging our own disbelief can lead to a deeper understanding and a more open-minded approach to complex issues. One way to overcome the argument from incredulity is to recognize that our personal understanding is not always the limit of what is possible or true. Just because we find something difficult to grasp or imagine doesn't mean it's not happening or that it's not supported by evidence. Learning to accept that there are things beyond our immediate understanding can help us engage with the world in a more thoughtful and open way. Instead of using incredulity as a reason to reject new ideas, we can seek out more information, ask questions, and be willing to accept that some things may be true even if they are hard to believe at first. Ultimately, the argument from incredulity is a barrier to understanding and progress. It prevents us from accepting new ideas or information based on our limited personal experiences or ability to understand something. By approaching challenges and new information with curiosity and a willingness to engage with the evidence, we can move past this fallacy and make more informed decisions about the world around us. The Motte and Bailey fallacy occurs when someone defends a controversial or weak position by substituting it with a simpler, more defensible one when challenged. Once the challenge has passed, they return to the original, more controversial or harder to defend position. This tactic relies on shifting between two positions, one that is easy to defend, the Motte, and one that is harder to defend, the Bailey, all while presenting them as if they are the same. For example, imagine someone argues that a certain policy is absolutely essential for the good of society, claiming that without it, society will collapse. This is the Bailey, the more controversial and difficult to defend position. When challenged by someone asking for specifics or pointing out the flaws in the argument, the person might then shift to a milder claim, like, "It's important to consider policies that improve society, and this policy is one such attempt." This milder statement is the Motte, a defensible, common-sense position that is difficult to argue against. After the challenge is over, the person then returns to the original, more controversial claim. In a political context, a politician might argue that strict government surveillance is necessary to protect national security, a claim that can be difficult to defend against privacy advocates. When faced with opposition, the politician might shift to a statement like, "We need to ensure that our security measures are effective and balanced," which is a more general and defensible position that sounds reasonable. Once the challenge to surveillance fades, the politician might return to the original position, pushing for more invasive surveillance programs. The tactic allows them to avoid a direct defense of the more controversial position by temporarily retreating to something easier to justify, and once the opposition is quiet, they return to the original argument. A common example of the Motte and Bailey fallacy can be found in debates about religion. A person might initially argue that religion is the only path to truth and meaning in life, a bold and challenging statement. When someone challenges them on how religion can be the sole path to truth, they might retreat to a more defensible position, like religion provides a framework for many people to find meaning and support in their lives, which is a far more reasonable claim. Once the challenge subsides, they return to their original, more extreme position, assuming that the retreat to the defensible claim has protected them long enough to do so. Another example can be seen in the context of environmental debates. A person might initially argue, "We must take drastic action to reverse climate change immediately, or humanity will face extinction." This is a strong and difficult claim to defend, particularly if they are asked for specific, evidence-based solutions. When faced with such challenges, they might retreat to a softer claim like, "We must take reasonable steps to mitigate climate change," which is a growing concern. This softer claim is far easier to support and is less likely to be met with skepticism. Once the opposition fades, they may return to their original, more extreme position. In business discussions, a company might argue that they need to drastically cut employee wages to increase profitability. This claim is controversial and difficult to defend. If they face backlash, the company might retreat to a less extreme position, saying, "We need to make adjustments to our workforce compensation structure in order to remain competitive and sustainable." This retreat allows the company to weather criticism by presenting a more reasonable approach. However, once the pressure dies down, they might return to the original argument, pushing for more severe cuts or changes. In the context of personal relationships, a person might argue, "I should be able to make all the decisions in our relationship because I know what's best." This is a highly controversial claim, one that many would immediately challenge. When confronted with such opposition, the person might retreat to a milder statement like, "I believe that in a relationship, it's important to work together and make decisions that benefit both people," which is a much more defensible position. Once the challenge is no longer present, the person may return to their original argument, trying again to assert control over decision-making in the relationship. The Motte and Bailey fallacy is effective because it allows the person using it to appear reasonable in the face of criticism, even though their original argument may be unreasonable or difficult to defend. By temporarily retreating to a position that is widely accepted and difficult to challenge, the person can avoid a direct confrontation with their more controversial stance. Once the challenge has passed, they return to their original position, which is the one they actually want to defend. This tactic works because the Motte, the defensible, easier-to-argue position, is often accepted without much resistance. It's a position that people can agree with without much debate. For example, most people would agree that we need to take steps to improve society, protect privacy, or address climate change. The Bailey, the more extreme or controversial stance, is the one that the person actually wants to argue for, but it's harder to defend because it might be based on ideological, economic, or moral positions that are not universally accepted. The key is that the person shifts between these two positions to avoid defending the harder-to-defend one directly. The Motte and Bailey fallacy is often used in political discourse, especially when people want to push through controversial policies or ideologies. By retreating to a simpler, less controversial position when challenged, they avoid losing support or credibility. The tactic is also used in online debates, where individuals or groups may push for extreme positions and then back off when criticized, only to return to the original stance once the criticism has passed. In the context of personal beliefs, this tactic allows individuals to maintain their position without having to fully defend it. For example, someone who believes in a controversial social or political idea might retreat to more commonly accepted views when questioned, only to go back to their original stance once the opposition has faded. This can make it difficult to pin down the person's true position, as they are shifting between two different arguments to avoid scrutiny. To avoid being misled by the Motte and Bailey fallacy, it is important to recognize when someone is shifting between an extreme position and a more defensible one. When you notice this tactic being used, it is crucial to call attention to the inconsistency between the two positions and ask for clarity on which one the person is actually defending. This helps ensure that the argument is focused on the original claim, not on a more easily defendable version of it. The Motte and Bailey fallacy relies on the tactic of avoiding direct engagement with controversial claims by hiding behind more palatable, defensible positions. It's an attempt to make a difficult argument seem more reasonable by temporarily retreating to a position that no one can easily oppose, only to return to the original argument once the scrutiny fades. By recognizing and addressing this fallacy, we can ensure that discussions remain focused on the actual points being made and are not derailed by shifting positions that are designed to avoid scrutiny. The appeal to nature fallacy occurs when someone argues that something is good, right, or better simply because it is natural. This type of reasoning assumes that anything found in nature is inherently good, healthy, or desirable, while anything artificial or human-made is inherently bad, unhealthy, or undesirable. However, this line of thinking is flawed because just because something is natural doesn't automatically make it better, safer, or more morally acceptable. The appeal to nature fallacy ignores the complexities of each situation and fails to critically evaluate the full context or evidence behind the claim. For example, someone might argue, eating natural, organic foods is always better than eating processed foods because organic food is natural. While organic food can be healthy and have benefits, the mere fact that something is organic does not guarantee that it is healthier or more nutritious. Organic foods can still be high in sugar, fats, or calories, just like processed foods. The appeal to nature fallacy ignores the importance of balanced nutrition and the need to evaluate food on a case-by-case basis, rather than assuming that organic automatically means healthy. This oversimplified view can lead to misleading conclusions about what constitutes a healthy diet. Another example can be found in discussions about medicine. Some people argue, natural remedies like herbs and plant-based treatments are better than pharmaceutical drugs because they are natural. While there are certainly effective natural remedies, the assumption that all natural treatments are better than synthetic ones is flawed. Many pharmaceutical drugs have been carefully developed and tested to treat specific conditions with proven efficacy, while some natural remedies have not undergone the same level of rigorous scientific testing. Just because something is natural doesn't mean it is always safe or effective. In fact, many plants and herbs can be toxic if not used properly, and some natural remedies can interact with other medications in harmful ways. The appeal to nature fallacy dismisses the need for evidence-based medicine in favor of the assumption that natural equals better. The appeal to nature fallacy also shows up in environmental discussions. For example, a person might argue, humans should stop using synthetic chemicals and return to natural methods of farming, because nature knows best. While it's important to consider sustainable farming practices, the argument overlooks the fact that nature can be harmful in certain contexts. For example, pests and diseases that occur in natural farming systems can destroy crops and harm food supplies. Additionally, natural farming methods are not always the most efficient or effective in feeding a growing global population. The appeal to nature fallacy ignores the potential benefits of scientific advancements and human innovation that can improve agricultural practices, such as genetic engineering, which can create crops that are more resistant to pests and diseases. By focusing solely on the natural, this fallacy dismisses the complexity of modern farming and the challenges of feeding billions of people. In the realm of health and fitness, the appeal to nature fallacy can be seen when someone argues, exercising outdoors is better than working out in a gym because it's more natural. While exercising in nature can be a refreshing and enjoyable experience, it's not inherently better than indoor exercise. The environment in which you exercise is less important than factors like consistency, intensity, and the type of activity you're doing. For some people, a gym offers better equipment, a more controlled environment, and a social setting that can motivate them to exercise more effectively. The appeal to nature fallacy assumes that being outside or using natural surroundings automatically makes an activity better, without considering the individual preferences and needs of the person involved. The appeal to nature fallacy also appears in moral and ethical debates. For instance, someone might argue, Homosexuality is unnatural, so it must be wrong. This argument assumes that because something doesn't happen naturally in the animal kingdom or because it goes against traditional societal norms, it must be morally wrong. However, just because something is not natural does not make it immoral or wrong. Many human behaviors, including cooperation, love, and friendship, are not solely based on biological instincts or natural occurrences. By dismissing human experiences based on the appeal to nature fallacy, this argument ignores the diversity of human behavior and experience, and it fails to address the real moral and ethical considerations behind such issues. Similarly, some might argue, we should live according to nature, so we should avoid modern technology and live in small, self-sustaining communities. While there are benefits to living in ways that are more connected to nature, such as sustainable living practices, this argument overlooks the fact that modern technology has brought numerous advancements that have greatly improved human life. Medical breakthroughs, clean energy, and transportation systems have all allowed people to live longer, healthier, and more connected lives. The appeal to nature fallacy overlooks the benefits of technological progress and assumes that all modern advancements are inherently harmful or unnatural, without considering the evidence of how these technologies have improved society. Another place where the appeal to nature fallacy is common is in discussions about parenting. Some might say, parents should always breastfeed their babies because it's natural and provides the best nutrition. While breastfeeding has many benefits and is a natural method of feeding babies, the argument ignores the reality that some mothers cannot breastfeed, and formula feeding can be a healthy and viable alternative. The appeal to nature fallacy assumes that because something is natural, it must be the best choice for all people, without considering individual circumstances, such as medical conditions, lifestyle choices, or personal preferences. Both breastfeeding and formula feeding can be healthy depending on the context, and the decision should be based on what works best for the mother and child. In politics, the appeal to nature fallacy can be seen in arguments about government policies. For example, someone might argue, we should return to a simpler, more natural way of governing, as the founding fathers intended, rather than the complex system we have today. While it's true that the founding fathers created a system of government with principles like democracy and freedom, their vision may not be practical or effective in the modern world. Society has changed drastically since the 18th century, and the complexities of contemporary issues require thoughtful solutions that may not have existed in the past. The appeal to nature fallacy assumes that the way things were done in the past is inherently better, without considering the benefits and challenges of evolving systems. One of the biggest problems with the appeal to nature fallacy is that it prevents us from critically evaluating ideas or practices based solely on their merits. By assuming that what is natural is always better, we ignore the possibility that human innovation, scientific progress, and modern solutions can solve problems in ways that nature alone cannot. Not everything natural is inherently good or beneficial. For example, many natural substances, such as poisonous plants or diseases, are harmful and should not be used or consumed. The idea that nature is always better can lead to an overly simplistic view of the world, where we fail to appreciate the complexities and nuances of various issues. To avoid falling into the trap of the appeal to nature fallacy, it's important to critically evaluate each claim or idea based on evidence, not simply on whether it's natural or artificial. Whether something is natural or unnatural should not be the deciding factor in determining whether it is beneficial or moral. Instead, we should look at the practical effects, scientific evidence, and real-world outcomes of different practices, policies, and behaviors, rather than relying on an uncritical assumption that nature always knows best. By doing so, we can make more informed decisions that are based on logic, evidence, and a deeper understanding of the world around us. The Nirvana fallacy occurs when someone dismisses a solution to a problem simply because it isn't perfect, or because they believe it doesn't fully solve all aspects of the issue. This type of reasoning assumes that if a solution isn't flawless or doesn't entirely resolve every part of a problem, then it's not worth pursuing at all. The fallacy is based on the idea that if you can't achieve the perfect result, it's better to abandon the effort altogether. However, this line of thinking ignores the reality that many solutions, even if they aren't perfect, can still significantly improve a situation and be far better than doing nothing. For example, imagine a debate about reducing pollution. One person argues, We should start reducing carbon emissions by promoting electric cars and improving public transportation. Even though it won't eliminate all pollution, the response from the other person might be, "But this plan doesn't completely eliminate pollution, so it's not worth doing." This is a Nirvana fallacy because it dismisses the proposed solution just because it doesn't fully solve the problem. While the plan may not be perfect, reducing carbon emissions through electric cars and better public transportation is still a significant step forward in addressing pollution. It's unrealistic to expect any solution to eliminate a complex problem entirely, but making progress is still valuable. Another example of the Nirvana fallacy can be found in healthcare debates. Suppose someone advocates for expanding healthcare access by implementing a government-run system, arguing that it would help millions of people get the care they need. A critic might respond, "But the system won't cover everyone perfectly, and there will still be waiting times for treatment. So why bother with it?" This argument assumes that if the solution isn't perfect and doesn't fix every issue in the system, it's not worth implementing. In reality, expanding access to healthcare, even if it isn't flawless, could still improve the lives of many people who currently lack affordable care. The Nirvana fallacy overlooks the benefits of partial solutions, focusing instead on the idea that if something can't be perfect, it's not worth doing. The Nirvana fallacy can also appear in environmental debates. For instance, someone might propose using renewable energy sources like solar and wind to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, but another person might argue, "These energy sources can't meet all of our energy needs yet, so we shouldn't bother investing in them." This is another example of the Nirvana fallacy because it dismisses the potential benefits of renewable energy simply because it isn't a perfect replacement for all fossil fuels at the moment. While renewable energy may not solve the entire energy crisis right now, it is still an important step in reducing environmental harm and can lead to further advancements in the future. In the context of education, a teacher might propose improving the quality of education by increasing funding for schools and providing better resources to teachers. A critic might say, "But that won't solve every issue in the education system, so it's not worth doing." This view ignores the fact that improving funding and resources can still have a significant positive impact on students' education, even if it doesn't address every single problem within the system. The Nirvana fallacy prevents meaningful improvements by demanding an all-or-nothing solution, even when partial improvements can make a real difference. The Nirvana fallacy is often used to dismiss progress on social issues. For example, someone might argue for improving women's rights, such as ensuring equal pay for equal work. A critic might respond, "But this won't completely eliminate discrimination in the workplace, so why even try?" This argument ignores the fact that while a law requiring equal pay for equal work might not solve every form of discrimination, it is still a step toward greater equality. By dismissing the solution because it doesn't fix everything at once, the critic fails to appreciate the value of incremental progress. In personal situations, the Nirvana fallacy can show up when someone tries to make a change but is discouraged because the change won't be perfect. For example, someone might want to adopt a healthier lifestyle by eating better and exercising more. However, they might think, "I can't stick to a strict diet and exercise routine perfectly, so it's not worth trying." This line of thinking can prevent someone from even starting a healthier lifestyle. Just because the person can't achieve perfection doesn't mean they can't make improvements that will still lead to better health. The Nirvana fallacy can trap people in a cycle of inaction by setting unrealistic expectations for perfection. The Nirvana fallacy also comes up in discussions about political or social reforms. For instance, a person might argue that a certain policy would help alleviate poverty by providing people with basic financial support. A critic might counter, "This policy won't completely eliminate poverty, so it's pointless." This argument assumes that only a perfect solution is worth pursuing, ignoring the fact that any effort to alleviate poverty, even if it doesn't eliminate it entirely, could still help many people lead better lives. The Nirvana fallacy overlooks the fact that progress, even if imperfect, is still an important step forward. The danger of the Nirvana fallacy is that it can prevent people from acting or making decisions that lead to meaningful change. By focusing solely on the idea that only a perfect solution is worth pursuing, it encourages inaction or the rejection of good ideas simply because they are not flawless. This mindset can lead to stagnation, where no progress is made because the expectation is that only the perfect solution is acceptable. In reality, many problems are complex, and solutions often require compromises or incremental steps. Expecting perfection from every solution can lead to frustration and prevent progress. The Nirvana fallacy can also make it harder to find solutions to issues that may not have easy answers. Instead of dismissing solutions that might not solve everything, we should appreciate that taking steps towards solving a problem, even if the solution isn't perfect, is often better than doing nothing at all. To avoid falling into the Nirvana fallacy, it's important to recognize that perfection is rarely achievable, especially with complex issues. Instead of looking for an all-encompassing solution that fixes everything, we should focus on the improvements that can be made and the positive impact that incremental changes can have. Small steps can lead to big changes over time, and just because something isn't perfect doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing. By embracing practical solutions, even if they don't fix every problem, we can make meaningful progress and create better outcomes. The Nirvana fallacy discourages the pursuit of progress by emphasizing unattainable perfection. It's important to challenge this fallacy by focusing on realistic, achievable solutions that can make a real difference. The perfect solution might not always be possible, but partial or imperfect solutions can still have a significant positive impact. Recognizing the value of incremental progress and being open to solutions that may not be flawless can lead to more effective and productive problem solving. The fallacy of false cause occurs when someone incorrectly assumes that one event causes another simply because they happen together or in sequence. This type of reasoning links two events based on their timing or appearance of correlation, without evidence showing a true causal relationship between them. In other words, it suggests that because one thing follows another, the first thing must have caused the second, even though this connection might not be true. For example, consider a person who wears a lucky shirt to an important meeting and then succeeds in the meeting. They might conclude, "The shirt made me successful." While it's true that they wore the shirt and the meeting went well, there's no logical reason to believe that the shirt caused the success. The false cause fallacy occurs when someone makes the assumption that the shirt was the reason for their success, ignoring other factors that could have played a role, such as preparation, skill, or luck. The fallacy arises from the belief that a correlation, wearing the shirt and succeeding, proves a cause and effect relationship, even when there is no evidence for it. A similar example can be found in weather-related claims. Imagine someone says, "It always rains when I wash my car." This statement links car washing with rain, suggesting that washing the car somehow causes the weather to change. Of course, this is not true. The correlation between washing the car and the rain happening shortly after is purely coincidental. There is no causal relationship between the two events. The false cause fallacy occurs when the person assumes that washing the car is what causes the rain, overlooking the true cause, which is the weather patterns that lead to rain. This fallacy often appears in discussions about health or medicine. A person might argue, "I took a supplement every day for a month, and then my energy levels improved. Therefore, the supplement caused the increase in energy." While it's possible that the supplement had a positive effect, the false cause fallacy lies in assuming that the supplement alone was responsible for the improvement. The person overlooks other factors such as diet, exercise, sleep, or even psychological effects like the placebo response, which could also have contributed to the increase in energy. By jumping to a conclusion based on a correlation without carefully evaluating all the factors at play, the person commits the false cause fallacy. The false cause fallacy can also be seen in economic debates. Imagine a politician argues, "Since we implemented tax cuts, the economy has improved. Therefore, the tax cuts caused the economic growth." While tax cuts and economic growth happen together, this argument assumes a direct causal relationship without considering other factors that could have influenced the economy, such as changes in global trade, shifts in consumer behavior, or other policy measures. The fallacy here is assuming that because two events occur in conjunction, one must have caused the other, without properly analyzing all the potential causes behind the economic growth. In social discussions, false cause can be found when people claim, "Crime rates went down after the city built a new sports stadium, so the stadium must have reduced crime." Although the construction of the stadium and the reduction in crime might have occurred at the same time, this doesn't mean the stadium caused the drop in crime. Other factors, such as improved policing, community programs, or changes in local demographics, could have played a larger role. By concluding that the stadium was the cause, the argument oversimplifies the situation and ignores the complex factors that influence crime rates. In legal contexts, the false cause fallacy might appear in cases where someone says, "The defendant must be guilty because they were seen leaving the scene of the crime." This type of reasoning assumes that just because the defendant was seen near the scene, they must have committed the crime. However, this conclusion ignores other possible explanations, such as the defendant being at the scene for an unrelated reason. The fact that two events happen close in time doesn't automatically establish a cause and effect relationship. Without proper evidence showing a direct link between the defendant's actions and the crime, this reasoning falls into the false cause fallacy. Another common example is the claim that using a new smartphone app has made my life better, so the app must be the reason for my improved well-being. This argument assumes that the app is the cause of the improvement, ignoring other factors that could have contributed, such as changes in lifestyle, mindset, or other personal habits. The fallacy occurs when the person disregards the possibility that other factors might have had a stronger influence on their well-being, focusing only on the app due to a perceived correlation. In education, a teacher might say, "After I started using this new teaching method, my students' grades improved, so the method must be the cause." While it's possible that the new method helped students, this reasoning fails to consider other variables that could have contributed, such as changes in student effort, timing of exams, or external factors like support from parents or other interventions. The fallacy occurs because the teacher assumes the new method was the sole cause of the improvement, without considering other possible explanations for the student's success. The false cause fallacy can also show up in media reporting. For example, a news outlet might report, "There was a rise in school shootings after violent video games became more popular, so video games must be causing the violence." This argument assumes a direct causal relationship between the rise in video game popularity and the increase in school shootings. However, the correlation does not prove causality. Many other factors, such as access to firearms, mental health issues, and social influences, could play a more significant role in the violence. The fallacy lies in oversimplifying a complex issue and attributing it to a single cause without adequate evidence. The false cause fallacy is also seen in advertising. For instance, an ad might claim, "Our product will help you lose weight quickly, just like it did for all our satisfied customers." The ad suggests a causal relationship between using the product and losing weight, but it doesn't take into account other factors that could contribute to weight loss, such as changes in diet, exercise, or metabolism. The fallacy occurs when the ad relies on an implied correlation between using the product and achieving results, without providing evidence of a true cause and effect relationship. In politics, the false cause fallacy can be used to oversimplify complex social issues. For example, a politician might argue, "When we raised the minimum wage, unemployment went up. Therefore, raising the minimum wage caused unemployment to rise." While there might be a correlation between these two events, the fallacy occurs when the politician assumes a direct cause and effect relationship. The reality is that many factors influence unemployment, including economic conditions, technological changes, and global market trends. The politician's argument ignores the broader context and jumps to a conclusion based on the timing of the events, rather than examining all the contributing factors. In discussions about historical events, people may fall into the false cause fallacy when they argue, "After the invention of the automobile, the number of cars on the road increased, so the automobile must have caused all the traffic problems." This reasoning ignores the fact that while the invention of the automobile contributed to traffic congestion, there are other factors, such as population growth, urbanization, and changes in transportation infrastructure, that also played a role in the problem. The fallacy occurs when the person attributes all the effects to the automobile, without considering the broader context of urban development and societal changes. The false cause fallacy is a common type of faulty reasoning because it relies on the assumption that correlation automatically implies causation. In reality, correlation does not equal causation. Just because two events occur together or in sequence doesn't mean one caused the other. When faced with claims of causality, it's essential to look for solid evidence that demonstrates a true cause and effect relationship, rather than accepting superficial correlations as proof. Recognizing the false cause fallacy helps ensure that conclusions are drawn based on logical reasoning and a complete understanding of the factors at play, rather than oversimplified assumptions. Reification is a logical fallacy where abstract concepts or ideas are treated as if they were real, concrete things. It involves assigning physical properties to intangible concepts, leading to a misunderstanding or oversimplification of complex ideas. This fallacy occurs when someone acts as though an abstract concept, like freedom, society, or justice, exists as a tangible object or force that can be interacted with in the same way one would engage with a physical object. For example, consider the statement, "Society is demanding change." The concept of society here is being treated as if it were an active agent with the ability to demand something, similar to how a person might make a request or demand something from another. Society itself is not a physical entity. It is a collective term for the people, institutions, and relationships within a given community. It does not have the ability to make demands independently. This type of thinking can lead to confusion, as it overlooks the fact that demands for change come from individuals or groups within society, not society itself as a monolithic entity. In politics, reification often occurs when someone says, "The economy needs to be fixed." The economy is not an actual entity or object. It is a system composed of various factors like employment, production, and consumption, driven by human behavior. Saying that the economy needs to be fixed gives it an artificial agency, as if it were a malfunctioning machine or an object requiring repair. This statement oversimplifies the situation because it treats the economy as if it were something that can be fixed in the same way a broken object might be repaired, ignoring the complexities and variables that affect economic systems. Another example of reification can be found in discussions about human nature. People might say, "Human nature dictates that people are selfish." Here, human nature is being treated as a concrete, fixed concept that determines people's behavior, as if it were an unchangeable force. However, human nature is a broad and complex concept, influenced by a range of psychological, social, and environmental factors. By reifying human nature, one assumes that people's behavior is entirely driven by a singular, predetermined characteristic, which disregards the complexity of human choices and the influence of external factors. Reification can also happen in the realm of psychology. For instance, consider a statement like, "Depression is taking over my life." Here, depression is treated as if it were an external force or entity with the power to control someone's life, rather than an internal condition that affects mood and behavior. This statement oversimplifies the reality of mental health, where depression is a condition influenced by a variety of psychological, biological, and environmental factors, rather than a tangible force that takes control of a person. Reifying depression in this way can contribute to misunderstandings of how mental health works, making it seem like an external, inevitable force rather than a condition that can be managed or treated through various interventions. In the context of education, reification might be seen in statements like, "The education system is failing." The phrase, "the education system," is treated as a singular entity, capable of failure in the same way an individual might fail in a task. However, the education system is not a single thing. It's a complex network of institutions, policies, teachers, students, and other stakeholders. Saying that the system is failing ignores the specific factors that contribute to challenges in education, such as lack of resources, policy decisions, or societal inequalities. Reification in this case leads to a vague and unhelpful understanding of the issue, making it seem as if the entire system is at fault rather than addressing the complex causes behind educational challenges. In everyday life, people often reify abstract concepts without even realizing it. For example, when someone says, "Love is all you need," they are treating love as if it were a sufficient and singular solution to all problems, similar to how a tool might be the solution to a mechanical problem. Love, of course, is a powerful and important emotion, but it is not a tangible entity that can solve every challenge. By reifying love in this way, the statement oversimplifies the complexities of relationships, personal growth, and problem solving. It ignores the practical and tangible factors that contribute to healthy relationships, such as communication, trust, and mutual respect. In religion or philosophy, reification can often occur when someone speaks about concepts like truth or goodness, as if they are physical things that exist in the world. For instance, truth will eventually come to light suggests that truth is an object that can emerge from hiding, much like an item being revealed from a box. However, truth is not a physical object that can be hidden or revealed in this way. It's a concept that is understood and interpreted by individuals or societies based on facts, context, and perspective. Reifying truth leads to misunderstandings about how truth is constructed and understood, as well as how it can be discovered or communicated. In the realm of business, reification might show up in statements such as, "The company needs to innovate to stay competitive." The company is being treated as if it were an individual with the ability to think, decide, and take action, rather than a collective entity made up of people who are responsible for making decisions. While it is true that companies must innovate to stay competitive, treating the company as a singular force or entity that can innovate on its own is misleading. The innovation process involves the people within the company, executives, managers, employees, and their actions, decisions, and collaboration. Reification here shifts the focus away from the human element and places undue emphasis on an abstract concept as if it were a standalone entity capable of action. Another example can be found in arguments about society or culture. A person might argue, "Society wants us to act a certain way," implying that society has its own desires or intentions. In this case, society is treated as if it were a person with the ability to want or desire things. However, society is not a single entity with its own mind. It is made up of individuals and groups who have differing views, desires, and behaviors. Reifying society in this way leads to an oversimplified view of complex social dynamics and ignores the diversity of opinions and actions within any given community. In politics, one might say, "The government should listen to the people." This statement reifies the people, treating them as a singular entity with one unified voice or opinion. However, the people in any society are diverse and hold a variety of different opinions. The idea that the people can be treated as one coherent group with a single set of interests ignores the complexity of democracy and the different needs and desires of various individuals and groups within society. Reification can also appear in conversations about abstract social concepts. For example, when people say, "The system is rigged," they treat the system as if it were a concrete entity actively working against people. The system can refer to various structures and institutions, such as the economy, government, or legal system, but it is not a single, cohesive force that has agency. By reifying the system, the speaker oversimplifies the challenges or issues that exist within those structures, as if they were deliberately and uniformly designed to harm or control, when in fact the realities are much more complicated. Reification occurs whenever an abstract or complex concept is treated as though it has tangible existence, making it seem like it operates independently of the people who influence or create it. This fallacy can lead to misunderstandings and oversimplified views of important issues, from societal problems to personal experiences. By focusing on the specific elements that make up a concept, rather than treating it as a singular, concrete entity, we can develop a more nuanced and accurate understanding of complex ideas. Understanding the difference between abstract concepts and tangible realities helps avoid the pitfalls of reification and encourages more thoughtful, accurate discussions. The fallacy fallacy occurs when someone assumes that because an argument contains a flaw, its conclusion must also be false. This is a mistake because the presence of a fallacy does not automatically invalidate the conclusion. A fallacy is a mistake in reasoning, but this does not necessarily mean that the conclusion it supports is wrong. To understand this, let's break it down further with a few examples. Imagine someone argues that all dogs are animals. Therefore, my dog is an animal. This is a perfectly valid argument. However, if someone points out a minor flaw, like the fact that the speaker did not specify the breed of the dog, it would not make the conclusion wrong. The fact that the argument lacks certain details does not change the truth of the statement, "My dog is an animal." The fallacy fallacy would be to dismiss this conclusion simply because the argument was not worded perfectly. Let's look at another example involving a more complex argument. Suppose someone argues that The Earth is flat because many people have believed in this for centuries. This is an example of an appeal to tradition fallacy. However, just because this argument is based on a fallacy does not mean that the conclusion, that the Earth is flat, is correct. In reality, the Earth is not flat, but it is because of scientific evidence, not because of the fallacy in the argument. If you dismissed the conclusion merely because the argument had a flaw, you would fall into the trap of the fallacy fallacy. Now, let's consider a scenario where someone argues that all politicians lie. Therefore, the politician I'm voting for will lie too. This argument may involve a hasty generalization, another type of logical flaw. The argument makes a sweeping assumption that all politicians are liars, based on the behavior of some. But even though the reasoning behind this argument is flawed, that doesn't mean the conclusion is automatically false. It is entirely possible that the politician in question will tell the truth. Again, the fallacy fallacy would be assuming that the politician must lie simply because the reasoning behind the argument is weak. In more everyday scenarios, the fallacy fallacy can happen in any debate or discussion. For instance, someone might argue that you should not trust this study on climate change because it was funded by a corporation with a vested interest. This is an ad hominem attack, a type of fallacy where the focus is shifted from the argument to the person or entity behind it. But just because the study was funded by a corporation doesn't necessarily mean the study's conclusions are false. Dismissing the findings entirely because of the fallacy in the argument is an example of the fallacy fallacy. It's important to recognize that the fallacy fallacy occurs when you focus too much on the flaws in reasoning and lose sight of the conclusion itself. This can be problematic in debates, as it can lead to dismissing valid conclusions simply because the argument supporting them contains errors. The fallacy doesn't make the conclusion wrong, it just highlights weaknesses in the way the argument was made. Another way this fallacy can show up is in political discourse. For instance, if a politician argues for a certain policy based on faulty reasoning or a misleading argument, it doesn't necessarily mean that the policy is bad or that it will fail. The conclusion, support for the policy, could still be valid, even if the reasoning behind it is flawed. Just because an argument has a fallacy doesn't mean the conclusion is false. In everyday reasoning, people often jump to conclusions based on fallacious arguments. This can happen when someone says, "That restaurant must be bad because a bad review was written about it." Even if the review contains flaws, like personal bias or unfair judgments, the restaurant's quality could still be fine. The argument's flaw doesn't automatically mean that the conclusion is false. The fallacy fallacy is not just an error in logic, but also a form of overcompensation. People tend to focus on finding weaknesses in an argument rather than evaluating the truth of the conclusion itself. This can lead to a sort of false sense of security, where the focus shifts to the flaws in reasoning rather than engaging with the actual substance of the discussion. It's also worth mentioning that not all fallacies are created equal. Some fallacies are more serious than others and can significantly undermine an argument. However, the mere presence of a fallacy doesn't guarantee that the conclusion is wrong. This is why it's important to evaluate the conclusion independently of the argument's flaws. Sometimes you might need to dig deeper, seek out more evidence, and engage with the substance of the issue rather than simply dismissing it based on faulty reasoning. In the context of science, for instance, a flawed hypothesis doesn't automatically make the conclusion false. Researchers may arrive at a correct conclusion through an imperfect process. That's why it's important to separate the validity of an argument from the validity of the conclusion it leads to. The fact that a scientific theory has flaws in its development doesn't mean the theory itself is incorrect. Similarly, in legal reasoning, an attorney may present a case with flawed logic. This doesn't necessarily mean the defendant is guilty or innocent. The conclusion must be evaluated on its own merits, based on the evidence and facts, not just on the flaws in the arguments presented. The fallacy fallacy could lead to an unfair dismissal of a case or argument, when the conclusion might still stand up to scrutiny. In conclusion, the fallacy fallacy is a common mistake where people assume that the presence of a fallacy means the conclusion must be false. It's a reminder to assess the strength of conclusions separately from the flaws in the reasoning used to reach them. The fallacy does not negate the truth of the conclusion. Instead, it simply highlights the need to focus on the quality of the evidence and reasoning supporting the claim, rather than just dismissing the claim outright based on faulty logic.